Hello, dear listener. I invite you now to find a comfortable place, set your volume low and gentle, and close your eyes. Allow yourself to rest quietly, with no need to move, no need to think of tomorrow. Just let the words carry you slowly towards sleep. Tonight, we begin the very first story in our series of boring history for sleep. It is called What the Assyrians Left Behind. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm bedtime histories, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can join us every night. And now, let us drift back in time together. The Assyrian world now rests in silence. Yet if you close your eyes and listen carefully, you may almost hear the faint echo of their footsteps across dusty streets, their voices murmuring in forgotten marketplaces, their tools scraping against stone as they carved images of kings and gods into walls that still stand though the people who made them are long gone. The Assyrians were not always mighty conquerors, as later stories made them seem. At first, they were a people who lived along the northern stretch of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris River and the rolling plains where wheat and barley grew in the heat of the sun. Their towns were simple, their routines predictable, and yet from these beginnings, they slowly shaped a civilization that left behind more than war. They left tablets of clay covered with writing pressed by reeds. They left reliefs carved into alabaster that told of hunts and processions, and they left layers of walls and foundations that speak more softly than any tale of battle. If you were to wander through the ruins of Nineveh or Nimrud today, you would not find the rush of armies or the cry of victory. You would find stone lions resting quietly, gates that once opened to thousands now opening only to the wind, and fragments of libraries where scribes once cataloged the thoughts of centuries. These fragments are boring in the best way, for they tell us of people concerned not only with kings, but also with grain harvests, lists of offerings, measurements of fields, and the prices of donkeys. The Assyrians recorded the mundane details of their lives, and these records, though tedious to read, are what remain steady after the noise of power fades. Imagine an Assyrian scribe seated cross-legged in a dimly lit room, pressing his stylus into a soft tablet of clay, repeating the same strokes again and again. He does not think of us. He does not know his work will be baked hard by fire or sun, preserved by chance beneath collapsed walls. Yet it is this routine, this monotonous record-keeping, that allows us to hear him now across thousands of years. While kings carved their victories, scribes listed shipments of grain. While generals planned campaigns, farmers watered fields and drove herds along riverbanks. What they left behind is not only glory, but the ordinary texture of existence, the same dull rhythm of seasons that you too know when you feel the slow passing of days. In the palaces of Assyrian rulers, there were long hallways lined with panels of carved stone. These panels were covered with images, soldiers marching in stiff lines, hunters pulling bows against lions, kings standing tall beside winged spirits. To the visitor, they would have seemed impressive, yet to the artisans, they were long hours of steady labor, cutting grooves into stone day after day, year after year. You can picture them leaning close, adjusting their chisels, breathing the dust of their own work, thinking perhaps of their families at home, of meals waiting after the sunset. They did not imagine that their tedious craft would one day be placed in glass cases of distant museums, admired under quiet light by people who no longer remember their names. Still, the marks they left are gentle reminders of time's patience. Assyria also left behind gardens, though most have vanished. One of the world's wonders, the Hanging Gardens, was sometimes said to be in Babylon, sometimes in Nineveh. Wherever it truly was, it would not have been a place of magic, but of daily care. Servants watering plants, carrying buckets, trimming leaves, step by step, routine by routine, the gardens would live only through ordinary attention. And so their memory, even when blurred by legend, speaks not of sudden marvels, but of steady hands. When Assyria's power ended, when Babylon rose and the empire collapsed, what endured were not the shouts of battle, but the quiet things left behind. A broken seal here, a half-finished tablet there, walls of mud brick hardened into hills, and stories written so plainly that they lull the reader into drowsy calm. In this way, the Assyrians have given us something unexpected. Not a song of triumph, but a background hum, a steady drone of life continued long after its rulers vanished. To think of them now is not to imagine war, but to imagine stillness. Picture a room lined with shelves, each holding tablets inscribed with signs no longer spoken. Dust gathers, light fades, and silence fills the air. This is what they left us. A record so unexciting that it feels like a gentle tide washing against the mind, drawing thought away, inviting sleep. As you rest, let your mind wander along those quiet ruins. Let the names of Assyrian kings blur into each other. Let the records of barley shipments soften into a distant murmur. Let the steady rhythm of the Tigris River flow past your imagination. You do not need to remember each detail, for the Assyrians themselves have been mostly forgotten. What matters is the gentle weight of time, the reminder that even empires, with all their noise, eventually leave behind only silence, only fragments, only the soothing monotony of history, fading into sleep. In the southern plains of Mesopotamia, long before Assyria rose, there were the Sumerians. They built their lives between the slow bends of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the earth was heavy with mud and the air was thick with heat. When you close your eyes, you can picture a Sumerian city, not with noise or grandeur, but with a steady rhythm, a quiet pattern repeated day after day. The houses were made of mud brick, simple squares and rectangles with flat roofs, all blending into one another until the city looked like an endless stretch of beige walls. Narrow lanes twisted between them, dusty and uneven, filled with the shuffle of sandaled feet. The people who lived there followed routines so ordinary that they might almost lull you to sleep. At dawn, farmers rose from their small rooms and walked out to the fields beyond the city walls. They carried hoes and plows pulled by oxen, their work slow and repetitive. The soil, cracked by the sun, needed water, so they dug canals, lifted buckets, and poured water in steady arcs. Hour after hour, under the weight of the day's heat, they bent, lifted, and spread seed. Their lives were not measured in events, but in the slow unfolding of seasons, one harvest after another. Inside the city, potters pressed clay on wheels, turning it round and round until jars and bowls took shape. The wheel creaked softly, the clay squelched beneath their hands, and time passed with each careful spin. Other artisans chipped stone, hammered copper, or wove reeds into mats, their work repetitive, their days blending into one another. It was not glory, but endurance that defined them. In the market, women set down baskets of onions, dates, and barley. Merchants unrolled cloth, weighed silver on small scales, and haggled in quiet voices. Donkeys carried loads of grain sacks, their hooves beating a steady rhythm against the stone pavement. There was no rush, no drama, only the slow exchange of goods, the same from one week to the next. Scribes sat in shaded rooms with clay tablets, just as Assyrians would later do. They pressed stylus marks into soft clay, listing debts, marking rations, recording agreements. Each mark looked the same as the one before, each tablet nearly identical to the last. And yet these records built the backbone of Sumerian life. Without them, the city would dissolve into confusion. But with them, routines continued smoothly, quietly, almost mechanically. Religion, too, was woven into the monotony. At the center of each city rose a ziggurat, a step temple of mud brick. Priests climbed its stairs to make offerings to the gods, but their rituals were less dramatic than the tall structure suggested. They placed bread, poured oil, burned incense, and recited words that had been recited countless times before. To them it was sacred duty. To us it is the dull heartbeat of faith repeated without change. Around the temples were small courtyards where people brought offerings, where musicians played slow rhythms on lyres, and where singers chanted hymns. Even this music was not meant to excite, but to echo like a soft hum, blending into the air, calming the heart. In the evenings, families gathered in their small homes. They lit oil lamps, ate flatbread with onions and fish, and told stories of kings and gods. The children listened, their eyes heavy, while the adults repeated tales they themselves had heard since childhood. The flicker of lamplight on mud walls, the smell of oil smoke, and the drone of voices made nights heavy and slow. Sleep came easily in such places. The Sumerians were not only inventors of writing, but of measurement, of law, of irrigation, of the calendar. Yet none of these things came suddenly or with excitement. They developed slowly, step by step, as people solved ordinary problems, how to divide fields, how to know when floods would come, how to measure grain. Their inventions were born not of brilliance in a single moment, but of endless repetition, of scribes counting, of farmers watching the river, of priests noting the stars. What they left us is not a single dramatic event, but a collection of small habits, layered together until they became civilization. And when you think of Sumer now, you should not think of war or conquest, for those were rare and fleeting. Instead, think of the quiet sound of a potter's wheel turning, of a farmer's footsteps in the soil, of a scribe's stylus tapping against clay. Think of the steady rhythm of life, so unchanging that it flows across thousands of years to reach you as a whisper. Daily life in the Sumerian cities was not meant to be remembered, yet it is exactly this monotony, this unremarkable persistence, that allows us to drift back in time. As you imagine their days, let your mind wander into stillness. Picture the flat roofs glowing in the evening sun, the canals carrying water through silent fields, the clay tablets stacked in dusty rooms, and the temples standing like patient guardians. All of it fades now, yet all of it remains, a soft echo of people who lived and worked and slept just as you do. Let this thought guide you gently toward rest, for the Sumerians remind us that history, like sleep, is built not of sudden bursts, but of steady, quiet continuities. When you hear the name Babylon, perhaps you imagine grand towers, mighty kings, and wonders of the world. Yet the truth of Babylon's rise was less dramatic than legend would have you believe. It was not an empire born in a single moment, nor did it spring from the ground fully formed. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of small changes, of dusty bricks stacked one atop another, of laws copied onto tablets, of markets repeating their same quiet rhythm year after year. To picture the rise of Babylon, imagine first a small town by the Euphrates River, with mud walls and narrow streets, where farmers brought in their grain and merchants spread out their goods on reed mats. Life there was not remarkable. It looked much like any other Mesopotamian settlement. But slowly, through patience and persistence, this town grew. Each harvest brought more surplus. Each surplus allowed more trade, and each trade brought more wealth. The city swelled gradually, its boundaries pushing outward as canals were dug and walls extended. There was no sudden explosion of power, only steady expansion. Kings came and went, their names etched into tablets, their decrees pressed into clay. Hammurabi, the most famous among them, is remembered for his code of laws. Yet even this was less an invention than a gathering of older customs written down in careful order. Imagine scribes bent over damp clay, marking the rules line by line. How much silver must be paid for a damaged field? What should happen if a builder's wall collapses? How to divide inheritance among sons? These were not thrilling tales, but lists, rules, repetitions, the kind of details that feel tedious when read, but essential when lived. It was this quiet framework of order that allowed Babylon to grow, not through sudden conquest, but through structure. In the streets of Babylon, traders called out in soft voices, bartering over wool, dates, and beer. Donkeys brayed under heavy loads, children chased one another between market stalls, and guards stood watch by the gates. Day after day, the same rhythm continued, the hum of a city alive, not with excitement but with routine. Along the river, boats carried grain downstream and returned with wood and stone, their sails rising and falling with the wind. The docks were crowded but not loud, filled with the slow labor of unloading baskets and jars. Babylon's temples rose step by step, ziggurats layered with mud bricks, each brick shaped and dried by hands that never knew they were building for eternity. Workers carried them in endless lines, placing one after another, the sun beating on their backs, the process stretching across years. To those who labored, it must have felt endless, yet their patience gave the city its enduring image. When Hammurabi extended Babylon's reach, it was not through sweeping battles, but through slow diplomacy and steady pressure. Neighboring cities were absorbed one by one, their rulers bent not by force alone, but by agreements, marriages, and the quiet inevitability of a rising power. The empire that emerged did not appear overnight. It crept forward like a tide, unremarkable in a single day, but undeniable across generations. The daily life of Babylonians changed little in this time. Farmers still planted barley in furrowed fields, Priests still recited hymns in the temples. Artisans still shaped clay into jars and tablets. Yet the framework of law and trade that held them together grew firmer, binding the city like threads in a loom. It was this quiet weaving of order that raised Babylon into prominence, more than any single act of conquest. To walk through Babylon as it slowly rose would not have felt like entering a place of destiny. It would have felt like stepping into another city of mud walls and markets, where the sun was hot and the river wide, where work filled the hours and sleep closed each day. Only over centuries did the accumulation of ordinary days give the impression of greatness. And so the story of Babylon's rise is not one of sudden wonder, but of steady repetition, of laws copied again and again, of bricks stacked higher each season, of markets that never rested, of prayers whispered endlessly to the gods. When you think of Babylon now, think less of its legendary gardens and more of its quiet persistence. Imagine the sound of stylus on clay, the shuffle of sandals on dust, the murmur of merchants in shaded stalls. These were the sounds that built an empire. They are soft sounds, repetitive and lulling, carrying you into the calm reminder that even the greatest cities were once nothing more than villages that grew slowly, quietly, patiently, until time itself gave them the weight of history. As you rest now, let the slow rise of Babylon remind you that growth is never sudden, that empires are built in silence, that the steady rhythm of ordinary life is what endures when legends fade. Far to the north of Mesopotamia, on the Anatolian plateau, where the summers were dry and the winters cold, the Hittites built their kingdom. Today their memory drifts quietly through broken stones and faint carvings, but in their time they lived not in constant battle, as stories sometimes suggest, but in the ordinary rhythm of daily life. When you close your eyes and let the noise of history fade, you may see their stone houses clustered inside high walls, narrow streets winding between them, smoke rising gently from hearths, and the sound of footsteps on packed earth. The Hittites were farmers as much as they were warriors, and most of their days were spent in fields outside the city. Oxen pulled wooden plows across soil that was rocky and stubborn, and farmers walked slowly behind, guiding the animals with patience. Wheat and barley were their staples, sown in autumn, harvested in spring, stored in granaries with care. It was not dramatic work, but repetitive and necessary, the same cycle year after year, a pattern as steady as the passing seasons. Women in Hittite towns tended to their households, grinding grain into flour on heavy stones, baking flatbread on clay hearths, weaving wool into fabric. Their hands moved in endless rhythm, pulling thread across looms, shaping dough into rounds, pouring water into jars. Children played nearby, chasing each other through courtyards, their laughter soft and fleeting, blending into the hum of everyday life. Artisans shaped bronze tools and weapons, though not with haste or glory, but with careful routine. The clang of hammer on metal rang out in steady intervals, echoing through workshops where men repeated the same motions hour after hour. Others carved stone seals, pressed clay tablets with cuneiform writing, or worked wood into carts and furniture. Each craft was practiced with quiet skill, passed down slowly through generations, without urgency, without spectacle. In the center of Hittite cities stood temples dedicated to their gods. These buildings, built of stone and timber, were the focus of ritual life, but their rituals were not grand displays. Priests lit fires, poured wine, placed bread, and recited prayers written centuries before. They performed ceremonies for the sun god, the storm god, and the goddess of fertility, each prayer repeated in the same tones, each gesture unchanged, year after year. For the people, these rituals brought comfort more than awe, for they were reminders that life followed a divine order as steady as the turning of seasons. Kings of the Hittites lived in palaces of stone, yet their rule too was shaped by routine. They oversaw scribes who copied treaties, laws, and records onto clay tablets. They managed grain supplies, arranged marriages, and wrote letters to neighboring rulers. The famous Hittite archives that modern scholars uncovered were filled not with thrilling tales, but with contracts, lists, inventories, and endless correspondence about shipments and obligations. Reading them today is like listening to a steady drone of administration, monotonous but essential to the empire's survival. Military life was also less dramatic than imagined. Though the Hittites are remembered for their chariots, most soldiers spent their days not in battle, but in preparation. They trained in drills, repaired weapons, cared for horses, and waited. Days turned into weeks of routine, the monotony of readiness stretching longer than any single clash of arms. Even in times of expansion, the empire grew slowly, absorbing towns through treaties and agreements more than through sudden wars. At home, evenings in Hittite cities were calm. Families gathered for meals of bread, lentils, and sometimes meat. They sat around low tables, spoke softly, and shared food, while lamps flickered against stone walls. The quiet murmur of conversation, the warmth of firelight, and the steady repetition of family life created a sense of continuity that outlasted kings and conquests. When we think of the Hittites now, we often remember their diplomacy, their treaties with Egypt, their chariots at Kadesh. But these were only moments. What truly defined them were the thousands of ordinary days, the farmers in fields, the women at looms, the scribes at their tablets, the priests repeating their rituals, the children laughing in dusty courtyards. These were the quiet threads of life that wove together into their history. And though their empire eventually faded, though their stones now crumble in silence, it is this daily monotony that they left behind for us. As you rest, imagine the hum of their lives, the clatter of tools, the murmur of prayers, the rhythm of plows across soil. It is steady, calm, unchanging, like a lullaby carried across centuries. The everyday life of the Hittites reminds us that history is not made only by battles and kings, but by repetition, patience, and the quiet strength of ordinary people living one day after another, until the memory of their lives becomes as soft and enduring as the whisper of sleep. When the name Carthage is spoken, many think first of ships on the sea, of wars against Rome, of generals like Hannibal leading elephants across mountains. Yet behind those images of conflict, there was another Carthage, a quieter Carthage, a city of walls and markets, of daily routines that stretched on with the same steady rhythm year after year. To imagine it now is to imagine a place where stone walls rose above the Mediterranean, not in sudden glory, but brick by brick, lifted by hands that worked slowly, tirelessly, repeating the same gestures under the hot sun. The walls of Carthage, strong and vast, were not built for a single moment. They were constructed over generations, each layer added by masons who cut stones from quarries, loaded them onto carts, and placed them carefully in lines. The sound was not of trumpets, but of chisels tapping, of wheels creaking, of men grunting under weight. Day after day they carried on, until the walls stretched for miles, enclosing the city in a circle of patient endurance. Within those walls, life followed patterns. Farmers from the countryside brought in their harvests. Olives pressed into oil, grapes crushed into wine, grain measured out in baskets. The markets filled with jars, fabrics, and spices, but their liveliness was more of a low hum than a clamor. Merchants argued quietly, scribes recorded weights, and buyers carried goods home in woven sacks. The air smelled of bread baking in ovens and fish drying in the sun. Donkeys plodded through narrow streets, their hooves clicking steadily, their packs filled with wood or clay pots. Craftsmen worked in shops where they carved ivory, polished glass, or wove textiles dyed in purple. The work was not quick or spectacular. It required patience, long hours, and steady hands. Lamps were molded, beads were strung, jars were shaped, each piece resembling the last. This repetition gave Carthage its wealth, yet it also gave it a kind of monotony, a rhythm that passed unnoticed by the people living it, but that shaped the texture of their days. The harbors of Carthage were famous, yet to walk there each morning was to see the same routine repeated endlessly. Ships arrived with timber, silver, and grain, and others left carrying oil, wine, and cloth. Dock workers unloaded cargo, stacking amphora in rows, hauling ropes, checking lists. The sea was calm most days, and the work was steady. There was no drama in a single load of grain, no story in a bundle of timber, but over centuries these exchanges built the strength of Carthage. The temples of the city stood in quiet dignity. Priests walked their courtyards, tended their fires, and poured offerings with practiced hands. Sacrifices were made, prayers spoken, incense burned, all in the same steady order, repeated day after day. Worshippers climbed steps, left gifts, bowed their heads, and returned to their homes. The cycle was never new, never surprising, but always the same, a thread of belief binding one generation to the next. Families in Carthage lived behind modest doorways, in houses of stone or mud brick. Inside, women prepared meals of bread, beans, and dates, stirring pots, grinding grain, and baking loaves. Children played with small clay toys, rolling wheels, or tossing pebbles. Men returned from fields or workshops, tired but steady, speaking of prices, harvests, and neighbors. At night, lamps flickered against walls, conversations drifted quietly, and eventually silence fell as families lay down to sleep. The walls outside, massive and unmoving, stood guard over their rest, as they had done for generations. When Rome finally came and Carthage fell, the walls that had seemed eternal were broken. Yet what remains of Carthage today is not only a memory of fire and conquest, but also the silent endurance of stone foundations, the faint outlines of markets, the traces of streets where ordinary people once walked. These remains speak more softly than the stories of war. They tell of masons shaping stones, of scribes pressing stylus into wax or clay, of farmers carrying olives in baskets, of merchants tallying their goods. They tell of repetition, of patience, of lives that passed without record, but that built the city piece by piece. And so when you think of Carthage, do not think only of Hannibal and his elephants, for they were but a moment. Think of the walls, the silent walls, built slowly and left to stand even in ruin. Think of the unchanging rhythm of daily life within them. Imagine the footsteps along stone streets, the sound of carts on cobbles, the murmur of voices in markets, the steady creak of ships in harbors. These were the true sounds of Carthage, not of war but of persistence. And now, as you let your body rest and your mind drift, let the image of those silent walls surround you, strong and steady, holding you in a circle of calm. For what Carthage left behind is not only history, but also the quiet reminder that even the mightiest cities are built on ordinary days, on repetition, on patience, on silence. In the western lands of Anatolia, between rolling hills and quiet rivers, there once lay the kingdom of Lydia. Its name lingers in history, whispered now and then in stories of kings and coinage. Yet the life of Lydia was not made of sudden wonders. It was made of patient routines, of markets that opened with the rising sun, of farmers bent over fields, of scribes marking lists with steady hands. To imagine Lydia as it truly was is to let go of drama and picture instead the slow rhythm of days that came and went with quiet regularity. The Lydians are remembered for inventing coinage, but even that invention was less an act of brilliance than the outcome of countless small exchanges. Before coins, they weighed lumps of silver and gold, balancing them on scales in shaded markets. This was tedious work, repeated endlessly, until someone thought to stamp pieces of metal with a mark so that weighing would no longer be needed. What we remember as innovation was simply the smoothing out of ordinary trade, the kind of adjustment that emerges slowly, unnoticed by those who lived through it. In the city of Sardis, the capital, the streets were lined with workshops where artisans hammered metal, dyed fabrics, carved stone. The sounds were not loud but rhythmic. The tap of hammer, the swish of die, the scratch of chisel, each repeated through long hours. Merchants walked the arcades, carrying trays of beads or jars of oil, their sandals clicking softly against stone. They greeted one another, bartered, and moved on. It was not extraordinary. It was simply the slow pulse of a city at work. Farmers outside Sardis tended fields of grain and orchards of fruit. They dug channels to guide water, pruned branches, harvested figs and olives. Their work was seasonal, repetitive, tied to the earth in the same way year after year. Children carried baskets, women ground grain into flour, men led oxen across furrows. In the distance, hills rose gently, dotted with sheep grazing under the watch of herdsmen. The scene was ordinary, yet it was this ordinariness that sustained Lydia for centuries. The palaces of Lydian kings stood on terraces above Sardis, yet even within their walls, life was shaped by routine. Courtiers copied letters, officials checked accounts, servants laid out meals of bread, meat, and wine. Musicians played lyres in slow, repeating melodies, their notes drifting softly through halls. The kings themselves sat in judgment, listening to disputes over land, hearing petitions, confirming agreements. Their power seemed great, but it too was carried on the backs of scribes, guards, farmers, and artisans, whose lives were filled with repetition. Religious rituals added another layer of monotony. Priests lit fires on altars, poured wine, burned incense, recited hymns. Worshippers brought offerings of bread or animals, bowed their heads, and returned home. The ceremonies were not new each time. They were echoes of centuries of tradition, performed in the same order, the same words, the same gestures. For the people of Lydia, these rituals brought comfort in their familiarity, binding them to gods and to one another through repetition. Even as Lydia grew wealthy, its life remained grounded in the small details of daily existence. Coins passed from hand to hand in markets. Ships carried goods across the Aegean. Envoys wrote letters to neighboring lands, yet none of these moments were explosive. They were threads in a long fabric, woven patiently until Lydia became known. When the Persians came and Lydia vanished into their empire, it did not fall in a single crash. It was absorbed, like a candle flame slowly swallowed by daylight. The coins remained, the markets continued, the fields still yielded their crops, and people still woke each morning to repeat the same routines. What disappeared was the name of the kingdom, the title of its kings, the independence of its palaces. What endured was the quiet hum of ordinary life, steady as it had always been. Today, among the ruins of Sardis, you might see a fragment of column, a broken mosaic, a stretch of stone road. They do not speak loudly, they whisper of lives once lived, of sandals scuffing across stone, of merchants calling softly, of priests chanting in temples, of coins exchanged with a clink that was barely noticed at the time. These remnants are not dramatic, but they are gentle reminders that Lydia existed, that it thrived quietly before fading quietly. And so as you think of the vanished kingdom of Lydia, let the silence of its ruins guide you into calm. Imagine the endless repetition of days, the coins passed hand to hand, the fields harvested in slow rhythm, the prayers murmured in temples. They are steady images, soothing in their monotony, carrying you toward sleep. For the true legacy of Lydia is not only invention, not only wealth, but the soft persistence of ordinary life, which endures long after kingdoms vanish. Far to the east, where the Indus River winds its long course through plains and valleys, there once flourished a civilization so quiet in its rise and so gentle in its disappearance that it leaves behind little more than bricks, drains, and shards of pottery. The Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called Harappan after one of its great cities, is remembered not for stories of kings or battles, but for its silence. No grand names echo from its history, no epic tales of conquest, only the steady hum of a people who built their cities with care and lived within them with calm repetition. To picture this world, imagine a city like Mohenjo-Daro. Its streets were laid out not in confusion, but in order, running straight in long lines, intersecting at right angles, forming blocks like a quiet grid. Houses of baked brick lined these streets, their walls smooth, their rooms arranged simply. Each house had a courtyard, small stairways leading to an upper floor, and drains that carried water away. The drains themselves, carefully built and covered with slabs, were perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the Harappans. Yet they were born not of spectacle, but of practical need. Each day water was poured, waste was carried away, and the system continued to flow, unnoticed but essential. Life inside these houses was simple. Families cooked meals of wheat, barley, and lentils. Women ground grain into flour on stone slabs, baked bread on hearths, stirred pots of stew. Children played with small terracotta toys, carts with wheels, little animals shaped by hand. Men worked at weaving cloth from cotton, a crop first cultivated here, their looms creaking softly, their hands moving in practiced rhythm. In workshops, artisans shaped beads of carnelian, agate, and shell, stringing them into necklaces that shone with subtle beauty. Others pressed seals from steatite, carving tiny images of animals and symbols, whose meaning is lost to us, but whose patterns were repeated with precision. The markets of these cities must have been calm gatherings. Merchants spread their goods, beads, cloth, grain, pottery, along shaded stalls. Buyers walked slowly, weighed items in their hands, bartered in quiet voices, and exchanged goods, sometimes perhaps using small weights of stone to measure. There was no rush, only the patient pace of trade that had gone on for generations. Beyond the cities stretched fields of wheat and barley, watered by the Indus and its canals. Farmers plowed with oxen, sowed seed, and harvested in the warmth of the sun. They stored their grain in great granaries, buildings of brick with orderly compartments, where harvests were stacked high and guarded against loss. The cycle of sowing and reaping, of storing and measuring, repeated year after year, steady as the flow of the river itself. The people of the Indus also built public baths, large rectangular pools lined with brick, filled with water carried through channels. These baths were not dramatic places of ceremony, but places of slow ritual cleansing, of quiet gathering, of water poured and shared. Imagine the still surface of the water, the sound of footsteps echoing on brick steps, the murmur of voices softened by the walls. This was not spectacle, but routine, a reflection of their calm order. Religion, if it was practiced, left no grand temples or monuments. Instead, small figurines of clay and stone suggest worship woven into daily life. A mother goddess here, a bull there, a seal with an image of a horned figure. These were not the grand altars of later empires, but modest tokens, repeated again and again in homes and workshops, symbols carried quietly through generations. And then, after centuries of this steady life, the cities of the Indus were abandoned. We do not know exactly why. Perhaps the river shifted its course, perhaps fields failed, perhaps change came slowly, as it always does. What remains today are streets overgrown with silence, walls of brick half buried in earth, seals with animals whose names we no longer know, beads scattered like forgotten whispers. To walk among these ruins now is to feel the calm weight of time. No stories of kings rise here, no echoes of battle shout across the stones. Instead, there is only the quiet murmur of lives once lived, of families who baked bread, of children who played, of artisans who carved, of farmers who harvested, of drains that carried water silently away. Their civilization is a lullaby, soft and repetitive, carrying us into rest. And so as you think of the Indus Valley, let the image of straight streets and still courtyards fill your mind. Let the sound of water in hidden drains soothe you. Let the rhythm of looms and the creak of carts lull you. Let the silence of vanished words calm you. For the Indus people left us no kings, no conquests, no noise, only the steady monotony of daily life, which endures as the gentlest gift history can give. A gift that, like sleep, surrounds you with silence and carries you into peace. Long before Rome became the great power of Italy, there were the Etruscans, a people whose cities dotted the hills of Tuscany and whose lives flowed with rhythms now mostly forgotten. Their rituals, once familiar and ordinary, now linger only as fragments in stone tombs, painted walls, and faint descriptions passed down through Roman writers. To think of the Etruscans is not to imagine sudden drama, but to picture ceremonies repeated quietly over generations, acts of worship performed so often that they became as natural as breathing, as steady as the rising and setting of the sun. Each morning, priests of the Etruscans studied the skies. They watched the flight of birds, the shapes of clouds, the patterns of thunder. These were not exciting visions, but slow observations, repeated endlessly, a patient search for meaning in the ordinary shifts of weather. They believed the gods spoke through signs, and so they wrote down their findings, marking tablets and whispering interpretations. To those who lived then, this was routine. Each day began with eyes turned to the heavens, waiting for patterns, noting the ordinary details of wind and wing. Another ritual came from the earth itself. When animals were sacrificed, the priests examined their livers, searching for omens in the shape of veins, the color of tissue, the placement of markings. The bronze model of a sheep's liver, found centuries later, shows how systematic this practice was, with each section labeled for a god. To us it seems strange, but to the Etruscans it was familiar, almost mechanical. Each sacrifice followed the same steps: the animal prepared, the prayers spoken, the examination carried out in steady detail. The priests repeated these acts hundreds of times in their lives, never with excitement, always with patient attention. Funerals, too, were marked by ritual. When an Etruscan died, the family gathered in tombs carved beneath the earth, rooms painted with scenes of banquets, dances, and games. The body was placed inside with offerings, cups of wine, dishes of food, jewelry, and small figurines. The ceremony was not one of sudden grief, but of continuity, a repetition of what had been done for ancestors before. Each tomb was prepared with care, each offering placed in quiet order, each gesture a reminder that life flowed on, even as individuals passed away. In their temples, the Etruscans offered gifts of bronze and terracotta. Statues of gods and goddesses stood silently, their features calm, their hands extended. Worshippers brought vessels, incense, or small coins, laid them at the feet of statues, and whispered prayers. The rituals were not dramatic performances, but steady habits, followed week after week, season after season. Fires were lit, incense smoke drifted upward, chants were spoken, and then life returned to its daily pace. Festivals punctuated the year, yet even these had a rhythm of repetition. Music played on pipes and lyres, dancers moved in circles, athletes competed in races and games. The people feasted on bread, wine, and meat, not with wild abandon, but with tradition, knowing that these gatherings were echoes of those held generations earlier. Each song repeated an old tune, each step followed an old pattern, each race mirrored those that had come before. The Etruscans believed that their rituals were essential to the balance between humans and gods. Without them, the world would lose its order, yet because they were repeated so often, they became as ordinary as the tasks of farming or weaving. And so an Etruscan farmer might spend his morning plowing fields, his afternoon offering grain at a shrine, his evening sitting at a table with family, repeating blessings before meals. Life was woven of rituals, small and large, each one blending into the next, until they formed a steady hum of devotion. Today, what remains of these rituals are faint traces. Painted walls and tombs show men reclining at banquets, women holding cups, musicians playing instruments. Archaeologists uncover small votive statues, fragments of incense burners, bits of bronze offerings. They do not tell a story of excitement. They tell of repetition, of countless acts performed so often that they wore grooves into memory. To walk through an Etruscan site now is to feel silence, but it is a silence shaped by centuries of steady prayer, steady offering, steady ceremony. As you let your mind drift, imagine the slow rituals of the Etruscans. Picture priests watching the sky with patient eyes, families placing offerings in tombs, worshippers lighting fires in temples, dancers moving in circles, music drifting softly into the air. These images are not dramatic but calming, soothing in their predictability. The forgotten rituals of the Etruscans remind us that history is often built not on sudden wonders, but on the quiet persistence of repeated acts, repeated prayers, repeated gestures. And as you rest now, you too can let the repetition of breath, the repetition of heartbeat, carry you into sleep, steady and calm, just as their rituals once carried them through life. On the island of Crete, surrounded by the quiet waters of the Mediterranean, there once lived the Minoans, a people whose memory now rests in fragments of painted walls, broken pottery, and the remains of sprawling palaces. Their life was not the dramatic story of sudden conquest or legendary kings, but the slow and ordinary rhythm of daily existence carried out for centuries until it faded into silence. When you imagine the Minoans, do not picture myths of labyrinths or monsters, for those were tales woven later. Picture instead the steady hum of a harbor where ships rocked gently on calm waters. Sailors carried jars of oil and wine across planks. Merchants unrolled cloth dyed in bright colors, and fishermen mended their nets while gulls circled overhead. This was not excitement but repetition, the same tasks done every day as the sea gave and the sea received. In the cities, most famously Knossos, life unfolded in patterns. Houses of stone and plaster lined narrow streets paved with flat stones. Courtyards filled with sunlight echoed with the voices of children playing, with the soft sounds of women grinding grain, with the steady tapping of artisans shaping tools and pottery. The palaces, though grand in scale, were less places of constant intrigue and more centers of administration, storage, and work. In long storerooms, jars known as pithoi stood in rows filled with oil, grain, and wine. Workers moved among them, lifting, pouring, recording. Scribes pressed marks into clay tablets to note the numbers, not as acts of creation but as routine entries in accounts. Each mark resembled the one before, each tablet nearly identical, part of a system of order that repeated year after year. The walls of the palaces bore paintings of bulls, dancers, and dolphins, but for those who made them, the work was steady labor. Artists mixed pigments, brushed layers onto plaster, traced familiar shapes again and again. The result might seem beautiful to us, but to them it was simply a continuation of patterns they knew well. Motifs passed down, repeated until they became tradition. Outside the palace walls, farmers tilled the land, guiding oxen through furrows, sowing seed, watering fields with simple channels. They harvested barley and wheat, tended groves of olive trees, and collected grapes for wine. Their work followed the seasons, predictable and repetitive. Year after year, the same plowing, the same sowing, the same reaping. Herds of goats and sheep grazed on the hillsides, their bells clinking softly as shepherds watched them in long stretches of quiet. Religious rituals of the Minoans also reflected repetition. In small shrines and sacred caves, people placed figurines of goddesses with raised arms, burned offerings, and poured libations. Priests and priestesses tended altars, lit fires, and chanted words carried down from generations before. These acts were not dramatic spectacles, but careful routines, performed in the same ways again and again. For the Minoans, the connection between humans and gods was maintained through this steady practice, through gestures that never changed. Even festivals where young people are believed to have leapt over bulls or danced in courtyards would not have felt like sudden wonders. They were parts of seasonal cycles, repeated with each year, each generation, the same songs, the same steps, the same movements traced over and over. At home, families lived simply. Meals were prepared from bread, olives, fish, and fruit. Clay lamps lit the evenings, smoke curled upward, and voices softened as night came on. Children slept on mats, parents spoke quietly, and outside the waves of the sea washed against the shore in their eternal rhythm. In the silence of those nights, the ordinary life of the Minoans carried on, unnoticed yet enduring. When their civilization faded, perhaps through natural disasters, perhaps through the arrival of new powers, it did not vanish in a single moment. It ebbed away like the tide, slowly, leaving behind ruins that now rest in calm. What remains tells us less about kings and battles, and more about the daily monotony of life. Storage jars lined in rows, drains that carried water, clay tablets filled with numbers, frescoes painted with familiar patterns. These fragments are gentle reminders that the Minoans lived as all people do, one ordinary day after another. As you think of them now, let your mind drift into that world of quiet harbors, sunlit courtyards, and flickering lamps. Imagine the slow repetition of their work, the calm rhythm of their festivals, the steady passage of seasons on their island. It is not a story of sudden wonders, but of ordinary life, patient and unchanging, a lullaby of history that invites you too to rest. When people hear of Akkad, they may think of the First Empire, of kings like Sargon, who stretched their rule across Mesopotamia. Yet what truly sustained Akkad was not conquest, but administration. It was the dull, repetitive labor of scribes, governors, and officials, the endless making of lists, the copying of records, the counting of grain, the tracking of workers, and the slow maintenance of order. The rise of Akkad was not thunder, but the soft scratching of reeds against clay. Imagine a hall in an Akkadian palace, its walls made of mud brick, its roof held up by wooden beams. Along the sides sit scribes with clay tablets before them. Each one holds a stylus of reed and presses it again and again into the damp surface, making marks that form signs of cuneiform. They are recording deliveries of barley, tallies of laborers, accounts of livestock, instructions from governors. The work is steady, endless, and almost silent, save for the occasional murmur between scribes and the faint thud of a tablet being set aside to dry. This was the hum of empire, not the clash of armies. Governors of provinces sent messengers carrying clay tablets back to the capital. These messages were not exciting proclamations, but routine reports. How much grain was harvested, how many oxen survived the winter, how taxes were collected, how canals were maintained. Couriers rode or walked for days to bring these tablets, only for them to be stacked in storerooms, filed away, added to shelves already filled with the same kinds of reports from previous seasons. To manage Akkad was to drown in repetition. In the countryside, farmers continued their labor. They dug irrigation canals, repaired dikes, and sowed seed. Their work was supervised by local officials who kept records of how much land each man cultivated, how many days of labor were owed, how much of the harvest must be delivered to the state. These officials carried tablets, measured fields with ropes, and noted every detail. To the farmer, each season felt like the one before. To the official, each tablet felt like all the rest. The system worked not because of brilliance, but because of monotony. In the city, warehouses held vast amounts of grain collected as tribute and tax. Workers carried baskets, poured grain into bins, measured it out for rations. Scribes stood nearby, marking every delivery, every removal, their styluses pressing the same marks they had pressed thousands of times before. Each transaction, no matter how small, had to be written, verified, and stored. The empire survived not on victories, but on the dull efficiency of storage and record. Religion too entered the sphere of administration. Priests kept lists of offerings, noting which animals were sacrificed, which goods were given to the gods, which rituals were performed on which days. Their tablets resembled those of the bureaucrats, endless lines of signs recording details that must be observed without fail. The gods were honored not through passion, but through repetition, through ceremonies carried out with unwavering sameness. Even the kings of Akkad, powerful in name, spent much of their time listening to officials read reports, confirming allocations of labor, signing decrees that followed the same formula as those of their fathers. They may have been remembered as conquerors, but much of their rule was spent in monotony, managing the machinery of empire through meetings, tallies, and decisions so ordinary that they blur into one another. When the Akkadian Empire eventually weakened, it was not with a single dramatic fall, but with the slow breakdown of this administrative web. Records became fewer, provinces stopped sending tribute, canals were left unrepaired, and the steady hum of scribes fell silent. What remains today are fragments of tablets, filled with numbers, names, and lists. They are not thrilling to read, yet they are the truest echo of Akkad. They show us a world where power depended less on battles than on paperwork, less on kings than on clerks, less on sudden glory than on patient repetition. As you think of Akkad now, imagine the steady scratching of stylus into clay, the quiet shuffle of officials moving tablets, the measured voices of scribes reading lists aloud, the endless flow of numbers, dates, and names. It is a monotone sound, like the soft ticking of a clock, soothing in its persistence. This was the dull administration of Akkad, the backbone of the First Empire, and like a lullaby, it reminds us that history is built not only on noise, but on silence, not only on victories, but on repetition. And so as you rest, let the thought of these quiet administrators carry you toward sleep, for they too lived and worked in patterns, steady and unchanging, until time itself faded their empire into dust. When we hear of Rome, we often picture triumphal parades, marble temples, and speeches that shook the Senate with thunderous applause. Yet the truth of a senator's daily life was far less dramatic, shaped not by constant action, but by endless routines, meetings, and the dull repetition of duty. To imagine an ordinary day for a Roman senator is to let the noise of legend fade, and to listen instead to the quiet sound of sandals on marble floors, the low murmur of voices in shaded courtyards, and the steady shuffle of scrolls unrolled and rolled again. A senator would begin his day at dawn, often roused not by excitement, but by the same slow rhythm as every morning. Servants opened shutters, let in the soft light, and brought water for washing. The senator dressed in his toga, a garment heavy and awkward, wrapped in layers that required assistance to arrange. It was not glamorous but cumbersome, a daily ritual of fabric folded and draped in the same fashion each time. After a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, or fruit, he made his way to the forum, accompanied by clients who sought favors. These clients greeted him with rehearsed words of respect, not with passion, but with routine courtesy, for this daily procession was as predictable as the rising sun. Each man in line asked for the same things: legal help, financial support, influence in small disputes, and the senator responded with the same promises, nods, or vague reassurances. It was less a conversation than a ritual, an exchange performed without change year after year. At the Curia, where the Senate met, The day unfolded with speeches, but even these were often monotonous. Senators debated taxes, grain shipments, provincial governors, temple repairs. Voices droned on, scrolls rustled, messengers entered and left. Most of the issues were not dramatic crises, but tedious matters of management. How much grain should be sent from Sicily? How should roads be repaired in Gaul? Which official should be assigned to a distant province? The debates might seem fierce in history books, but in reality they often dragged. One speaker after another repeating familiar arguments, while others shifted in their seats, their minds drifting elsewhere. The afternoon brought further duties. The senator might sit in a tribunal, hearing cases brought by citizens. These were rarely dramatic trials. More often they were disputes over property lines, inheritance, or contracts. Witnesses gave testimony, scribes recorded words, judgments were issued. Each case resembled the last, the details changing, but the rhythm staying the same. Petitioner speaks, defendant replies, witnesses confirm, judgment delivered. The senator's role was less of excitement than of patience, enduring the slow machinery of law. Between meetings, he returned home to his domus, where scribes read aloud letters from governors or allies in distant provinces. These letters were filled not with urgent news, but with routine updates. How taxes were collected, how harvests fared, how soldiers drilled. The senator listened, nodded, gave instructions, and moved on. Meals, too, followed a rhythm. At midday, he ate lightly, bread, olives, perhaps fish, before resting in the heat. In the evening, he reclined at a larger meal, joined by family or guests. Conversations circled around politics, literature, and philosophy, yet even here it was often ritualized, with familiar topics returning night after night. Wine was poured, courses served, musicians played soft tunes on lyres, slaves moved quietly with trays. It was a performance repeated countless times, less a feast than a pattern. As the day drew to a close, lamps flickered in the halls of his house, casting long shadows on painted walls. The senator might review accounts with his steward, counting coin, checking lists of supplies from estates. Numbers were recited, agreements confirmed, debts recorded. These tasks were dull yet essential, the backbone of his wealth and influence. Finally, he lay down to rest, his toga set aside, his servants retreating into silence. Another day had passed, much like the one before and the one to come, a chain of repetition that defined his life more than any moment of triumph. To imagine a Roman senator's ordinary day is not to see drama, but to see monotony. Meetings, debates, judgments, letters, meals, accounts, each performed in steady rhythm, each blending into the next. The grandeur of Rome was built on such days, days that seemed unremarkable, days that blurred into one another like footsteps on a worn stone road. And so as you let your eyes close, let this thought soothe you. Even the mighty lived in patterns. Even greatness was built on repetition. Even senators of Rome moved through days as ordinary as your own, filled with small duties and quiet routines, until history remembered them not for what they did each day, but for the steady accumulation of all those days together. When people think of ancient Greece, they often imagine philosophers in white robes debating under olive trees, soldiers marching into battle, or dramatists filling theaters with poetry and song. Yet behind the stories of brilliance and glory, there existed another Greece, quieter and far less glamorous. The Greece of officials and clerks, of endless paperwork, etched on stone or scratched onto wax tablets. The Greece of bureaucracy. To imagine this world is to picture not sudden flashes of genius, but the slow hum of administration, the dull rhythm of records and regulations repeated until they became the fabric of civic life. In Athens, where democracy was celebrated, the reality of governance depended on clerks who copied decrees, checked names, and counted votes. Each morning they sat in shaded colonnades, wax tablets balanced on their knees, styluses pressed again and again into the surface. They recorded who had paid their taxes, who had registered for military service, who owed debts to the city. The marks were small, repetitive, and countless. For every speech made in the assembly, there were hours of unseen labor carried out by men whose names were never remembered. At the courts, where citizens sat in judgment, bureaucratic routine filled the day. Jars filled with small bronze ballots were poured into counters. Tokens were distributed, cases were assigned by lot. Scribes wrote down the arguments of litigants. Witnesses repeated their statements. Verdicts were tallied. The process was long and unchanging, each case blending into the next. Though trials were sometimes heated, the machinery behind them was monotonous. The same steps followed again and again with mechanical regularity. Elsewhere, magistrates managed the city's finances, and their tasks were equally tedious. They checked accounts of temple treasuries, counted silver from mines, measured grain imported from distant ports. Every coin was weighed, every sack tallied, every figure recorded. Officials posted lists on stone slabs set up in public squares, their letters carved by stonemasons who worked slowly, letter by letter, line by line, repeating the same forms across countless decrees. These inscriptions, which now stand silent in museums, were not dramatic announcements but administrative necessities, records of taxes, rosters of soldiers, inventories of supplies. In other Greek cities, whether in Sparta, Corinth, or Thebes, the bureaucracy carried on in similar fashion. Officials counted livestock, listed property, kept track of land boundaries. Priests recorded offerings at temples, noting how many jars of oil or how many animals were given to the gods. These lists may appear dull to us, but they were essential to ensure order. Without them, festivals could not be supplied, armies could not be fed, and temples could not function. Life under Greek bureaucracy was a life of repetition. Citizens waited in lines to present petitions. Officials stamped documents with seals. Scribes copied out contracts. Each interaction followed a familiar script: name, payment, record, confirmation. The individuals changed, but the process remained the same, day after day, year after year. Even the philosophers who criticized bureaucracy relied on it, for their schools and gatherings depended on the city's tax and the officials who collected and distributed them. The bureaucracy was the hidden foundation, as dull and steady as the stones of the city walls. When you walk among the ruins of Greece today, you may see columns and temples, but you might also find blocks of stone inscribed with names, numbers, and decrees. They stand as silent testimony to the monotony of administration. They remind us that behind the brilliance of Greece was the patient labor of clerks and carvers, the quiet hum of bureaucracy that rarely entered stories but always shaped reality. To think of Greek bureaucracy is to think not of sudden inspiration, but of endless repetition, of styluses scratching whack, of chisels cutting letters, of clerks reading lists aloud in steady voices. It is a monotone sound, a background rhythm, soothing in its predictability. And as you rest now, let this monotony carry you. Imagine the officials seated in rows, the scribes bending over tablets, the slow carving of letters into stone. Hear the soft murmur of voices reciting names, the shuffle of citizens waiting their turn, the steady beat of civic life moving on without pause. For in the monotony of Greek bureaucracy, we find a gentle reminder. History is not only the brilliance of philosophers or the victories of generals, but also the quiet persistence of administration, the dull yet necessary repetition that holds societies together. And like the rhythm of your breath as you drift to sleep, it is this very monotony that calms the mind and lulls you into rest. When people think of ancient Egypt, they often picture pyramids rising into the sky, temples carved with hieroglyphs, and pharaohs adorned in gold. Yet the true life of Egypt was carried not by kings, but by farmers, by men and women who worked along the banks of the Nile in quiet repetition, tending crops whose steady growth sustained the civilization for thousands of years. Their story is not one of sudden marvels, but of daily labor, of hands in soil, of the slow rhythm of planting and harvest. The Nile was at the center of everything. Each year, when the river flooded, its waters spread across the fields, leaving behind a layer of rich black silt. Farmers waited patiently for this moment, for it was predictable, arriving with the seasons. They marked the days, watched the rising waters, and prepared their tools. When the floods receded, they led oxen into the fields, dragging plows of wood that scratched lines into the damp earth. The sound was not loud, only the creak of harnesses, the soft squelch of mud beneath hooves, the low voices of men guiding animals along furrows. Into these furrows, seeds of barley and emmer wheat were dropped, handfuls scattered evenly, covered with soil, pushed gently by feet. Day after day, the farmers repeated these actions until the field stretched wide with hope of grain. Women and children joined in, carrying baskets of seed, pulling weeds, fetching water. They worked together, their movements simple and steady. Along the canals, men lifted water with shadufs, wooden poles with counterweights, swinging buckets up and down in slow rhythm, pouring water into channels that wound through the fields. The work was tiring but monotonous, the same motion repeated again and again under the heat of the Egyptian sun. As the crops grew, the farmers tended them carefully. They drove away birds with slings and clappers, guarded against pests, and watched the skies. The plants swayed in the breeze, green rows stretching toward the horizon, their growth almost imperceptible day to day, yet steady across the weeks. When harvest came, families moved through the fields with sickles of flint or bronze, cutting stalks by hand, binding them into sheaves, stacking them in carts. Donkeys carried loads to threshing floors where oxen trampled grain from stalks, round and round, hour after hour, until the kernels were separated. Women winnowed the grain by tossing it into the air, letting the breeze carry away the chaff. The process was slow, repetitive, and utterly essential. From this grain came bread, the staple of life, baked daily in clay ovens. The smell of baking loaves drifted through villages, mixing with the smoke of fires and the voices of families gathering at dusk. Beer, too, was brewed from barley, thick and nourishing, poured into jars and shared at meals. These were the true treasures of Egypt, more important than gold or monuments, for without them, the temples and pyramids could not have been built. Taxes were taken in grain, measured carefully by scribes who stood beside farmers at harvest time. They held measuring rods and tall jars, watching as each farmer delivered his share. Numbers were scratched onto tablets or painted on papyrus, each entry resembling countless others, a dull but necessary record. The farmers bowed, left their portion, and carried the rest home. It was a system of repetition, year after year, harvest after harvest, sustaining the state while leaving enough for the family. Life in the villages was modest, houses of mud brick lined narrow lanes with roofs of reeds or wood. Inside, families sat on mats, ate bread, beans, and onions, and told stories by lamplight. Children played with small clay dolls or chased each other in the dust. Women spun flax into linen, weaving fabric on looms. Men mended tools, prepared for the next season, or tended small flocks of goats. Nothing changed quickly, yet everything moved forward in the same steady pattern. Religion was bound to the cycles of farming. Farmers gave thanks to the Nile, to gods like Hapi who brought the flood, to Osiris who symbolized growth and rebirth. Offerings of grain were left at shrines, prayers murmured with hope for steady harvests. The rituals were not grand but familiar, repeated each season, just as planting and reaping were repeated. In this way, farming and faith blended into one rhythm of life. When you think of ancient Egypt, do not think only of pharaohs and monuments. Think of the farmers rising at dawn, walking into fields still damp with dew, guiding oxen, scattering seed, lifting water, cutting stalks, baking bread. Their lives were built on monotony, on the patience of waiting for crops to grow, on the steady labor that never ended. And though their names are forgotten, their work is what allowed Egypt to endure for millennia. As you let your body rest, imagine the slow flow of the Nile, the swing of the shaduf, the rustle of grain in the breeze, the creak of wooden carts, the smell of bread baking at dusk. These are the sounds and scents of Egyptian farmers and their crops, soothing in their constancy, calming in their repetition, a gentle reminder that life itself is sustained not by wonders, but by ordinary acts repeated endlessly until they become the quiet heartbeat of civilization. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often think of knights in armor, kings in castles, and battles fought on wide fields. Yet for most people living in that time, the reality was far simpler, quieter, and far more repetitive. The peasants who made up the great majority of medieval Europe lived lives that followed the seasons, the soil, and the rhythm of work that changed little from one year to the next. Their days were not filled with glory, but with ordinary duties. The same tasks carried out again and again, slowly, patiently, until they became the pulse of life itself. A peasant's day began at dawn. The rooster crowed, the first light crept across thatched roofs, and families rose from beds of straw and wool. Breakfast was plain, often bread made from coarse grain, sometimes with cheese or thin pottage. After eating, men and women walked to the fields, tools in hand, oxen pulling wooden plows that cut through the damp earth. The work was steady, back and forth across the land, furrows drawn in long lines, seeds scattered, soil pressed down by weary feet. This labor was repeated each season, each year, with only small variations, for the needs of the land never changed. Women worked alongside men, and their duties stretched from dawn until dusk. They tended gardens near the cottages, growing onions, beans, and herbs. They carried water from wells or streams, spun wool into yarn, and wove cloth on looms. Their hands moved endlessly, pulling thread, stirring pots, scrubbing clothes in basins of water. Children too were part of this rhythm, chasing geese, gathering firewood, or watching sheep in pastures. Life was a pattern of small tasks, repeated without end. Meals were simple. Bread was the staple, eaten at nearly every sitting. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, simmered in iron pots. On rare occasions, meat was added, perhaps from a pig raised in the village or a chicken taken from the yard. Ale brewed at home was drunk daily, not as a luxury, but as a necessity, for water was not always safe. Eating was not an event but a routine. Nourishment taken in modest amounts, repeated day after day. The cottages of peasants were small, built of wood and mud with thatched roofs. Inside, smoke from the hearth drifted upward, filling the single room with warmth and haze. Beds were simple frames with straw, benches lined the walls, and tools hung where they could be reached. Light came from small openings or from candles of tallow, their flames dim and steady. Evenings were spent around the hearth, mending tools, telling stories, or sitting in silence, the day's work having drained the body. Religion too shaped their routines. On Sundays, bells rang from the church tower, calling villagers to gather. The service was the same each week, prayers spoken in Latin that few understood, but the repetition gave comfort. Festivals marked the year, linked to harvests or saints' days, with music, dancing, and feasting. Yet even these were predictable, woven into the cycle of labor. Faith was not separate from life. It was another rhythm, binding community through repeated rituals. The obligations of peasants to their lords added another layer of monotony. They owed labor on the lord's land, working fields or repairing fences, building barns or carrying wood. These tasks were called corvées, and they were required as part of the feudal system. Each duty was recorded, performed, and repeated, not with joy, but with acceptance, for it was the way of things. The seasons dictated everything. Spring was for plowing and sowing, summer for tending fields, autumn for harvest, winter for mending tools, and caring for animals indoors. The cycle repeated endlessly, each year a mirror of the last. Droughts, floods, or disease might interrupt, but the basic pattern held, a quiet hum of life tied to the soil. At night, when work was done, families gathered in dim cottages, their voices low, their movements slow. Outside, owls called across fields, and the wind moved through trees. Inside, the fire glowed, casting shadows on rough walls. Sleep came quickly, not as escape, but as part of the rhythm, the body too tired to resist rest. To imagine the life of medieval peasants is to imagine a world of repetition, where each day resembled the one before, where change was rare and time felt like an endless cycle of work, rest, and work again. There was little excitement, little grandeur, yet there was stability, a calm endurance that carried families through centuries. As you close your eyes now, let the thought of their quiet lives settle over you. Picture the field stretching wide, the plow moving slowly, the sound of sickles cutting grain, the smell of bread baking in hearths, the dim light of candles flickering in cottages. It is a world of monotony, but also of calm, a steady rhythm like your own breathing as you drift into sleep, reminded that history is not only battles and kings, but also the quiet persistence of ordinary people living their ordinary lives. Far from the noise of cities and the stir of markets, tucked into hills and valleys of the Byzantine world, stood monasteries where men lived in silence and repetition. Their lives were devoted not to excitement or sudden wonders, but to the quiet rhythm of prayer, work, and rest, carried out each day in the same steady order. To imagine the life of a Byzantine monk is to picture a world where time moved slowly, marked by bells, by chants, and by the turning of seasons, all wrapped in silence. The day began before sunrise. In the darkness of early morning, bells rang through the halls, calling the monks from their narrow cells. They rose from simple beds of wood, wrapped themselves in plain robes, and walked in silence to the chapel. The air was cool, the lamps flickered, and the smell of incense lingered from the night before. Together they stood and chanted psalms, their voices low and steady, repeating words that had been spoken for centuries. The chants flowed slowly, one verse after another, until the sun began to rise, painting light across stone walls. After prayer came work. Some monks copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, seated at long wooden desks, quills scratching across parchment. They copied not only sacred texts, but also histories, letters, and treatises, their eyes moving steadily line by line, their hands repeating the same motions hour after hour. The work was slow, the ink faint, the letters uniform, and though the words differed from one page to the next, the rhythm of copying never changed. Other monks tended the gardens, hoeing the soil, pulling weeds, planting vegetables, and gathering herbs. They moved quietly among rows of beans and onions, watering from clay jars, harvesting when the time was right. The garden was a place of order, each plant in its place, each season repeating the last. Animals too required care, chickens fed, goats milked, bees tended. These tasks were performed in silence, carried out as acts of devotion, not for profit but for sustenance. Meals were taken together in the refectory, a long hall with wooden tables. The monks ate in silence while one among them read aloud from scripture. Bread, lentils, olives, and sometimes fish formed the simple fare. The sound was of chewing, of pages turning, of the reader's steady voice. When the meal ended, prayers were said, and the monks returned to work. The hours of the day were punctuated by more prayers, each marked by the tolling of bells. At mid-morning, at noon, in the afternoon, the community gathered again to chant psalms and hymns. The chapel echoed with their voices, unhurried and unwavering. The same prayers were spoken each day, the same hymns sung, until the repetition itself became a kind of silence, a rhythm so constant that it blurred into the background of thought. In the evenings, as the sun set, the monks returned to prayer once more. Candles were lit, shadows stretched across the floor, and the chants rose slowly into the air. Afterward, they withdrew to their cells, small rooms with little more than a bed, a stool, and a cross. There they read quietly, prayed privately, or simply rested in silence until sleep came. The life of a Byzantine monastery was not marked by change. Days followed the same pattern, weeks turned into months, years into lifetimes, all filled with the same tasks and the same prayers. The monotony was not a burden, but a devotion, for through repetition the monks sought peace, a closeness to the divine, and a separation from the chaos of the outside world. To walk through the ruins of a monastery now is to feel that silence still lingering. Stone walls stand, arches rise against the sky, and faint carvings remain. They whisper of men who once lived here, who walked the cloisters, who bent over manuscripts, who tilled gardens, who prayed in darkness before dawn. Their names are forgotten, their words unknown, but their rhythm remains, steady and calming. As you let yourself drift toward rest, imagine the quiet of those halls, the flicker of lamplight, the soft sound of quills on parchment, the slow chant of psalms, the tolling of bells in the distance. It is a world of monotony, of silence, of repetition, soothing in its constancy, reminding you that peace is often found not in noise, but in the gentle patterns of daily life. The monks of Byzantium lived and died within that rhythm, and in their steadiness they left behind a lullaby of history, carrying you softly toward sleep. The Phoenicians are remembered as sailors and traders, a people who crossed the Mediterranean in sturdy ships, leaving behind colonies and ports that linked distant lands. Yet their story is not one of sudden discovery or dramatic adventure, but of steady repetition. Voyages made again and again, goods loaded and unloaded, markets opened and closed. The same trade routes followed for centuries until they became as familiar as the paths of rivers or the grooves of worn roads. To imagine their lives is to picture a quiet rhythm of sails rising with the morning wind, oars dipping in slow unison, and harbors echoing with the sound of ropes and wooden hulls. A Phoenician ship set out at dawn, its crew moving in practiced order. Sailors raised the mast, tied knots, adjusted rigging, all tasks so familiar they required no thought. The sea stretched calm and wide, waves lapping gently against the hull. Day after day, these sailors followed the same coasts, from Tyre and Sidon across to Cyprus, along the shores of Anatolia, south to Egypt, west to Carthage, and beyond to Spain. Each journey was not an adventure but a routine. The sea lanes known, the stops predictable, the tasks repeated without end. The cargo was always much the same: timber cut from the cedar forests of Lebanon, shipped to lands where trees were scarce. Jars of purple dye, extracted from countless tiny shells, carried to kings and nobles who prized its rare color. Wine and oil, grain and glass, beads and jewelry, all packed into amphorae, stacked in ships' holds, balanced carefully so they would not break. Dockworkers loaded these goods with steady labor, baskets lifted, jars rolled, ropes pulled. At each port, the goods were exchanged for silver, tin, or other commodities, and then the ships turned homeward, carrying new cargo along the same long routes. The markets where Phoenicians traded were not scenes of chaos, but of calm bargaining. Merchants unrolled cloth, weighed metal, poured oil, and counted coins. Words passed in many languages, gestures repeated, deals sealed with nods or small marks on clay. The exchanges were simple, steady, the kind of commerce that does not change much across centuries. Behind this trade lay the monotony of preparation. Timber had to be cut, dye had to be extracted, amphorae had to be shaped and fired. In workshops near the coast, men crushed shells, stirred vats, boiled mixtures, and waited. The smell was strong, the labor slow, but the product was prized. Glass was melted, beads were strung, tools were hammered, each piece resembling many others, made not as art, but as stock for trade. Day after day, workers repeated the same motions until warehouses filled with goods for export. The sailors' lives followed a rhythm too. On board, they repaired sails, patched planks, baled water, and steered by stars. Nights were spent on deck, wrapped in cloaks, listening to the sea's steady wash against wood. Meals were plain, bread and dried fish, eaten quietly as the ship creaked and swayed. At each port, the crew tied ropes, lowered planks, and repeated the same unloading as before. There was little novelty, only the repetition of a trade that was as much routine as survival. In their cities, the Phoenicians built temples and shrines, but even these were linked to trade. Offerings were given for safe voyages, sacrifices made before departures, prayers repeated for calm seas. The gods of the Phoenicians, like the gods of other peoples, were honored not with sudden invention, but with steady ritual. The same fires lit, the same words spoken, the same gestures performed by generations of sailors before setting sail. Over time, the trade routes of the Phoenicians stretched farther and farther, but they remained familiar patterns. Colonies were founded, not with sudden drama, but with the slow building of walls, the digging of wells, the setting of markets. Each new settlement resembled the last, each port a link in the chain. The long trade routes were not heroic journeys, but endless loops, circling again and again, like the turning of a wheel. When the Phoenicians finally faded, absorbed into greater empires, what endured was not their kings or their wars, but a quiet persistence of their trade. The ruins of their ports still stand, stones worn by centuries of waves, fragments of amphorae still buried in harbors. They whisper of ships that came and went, of sailors who worked in silence, of merchants who repeated the same bargains, of routes that stretched across the sea like threads woven into a fabric. As you rest, let the image of these long trade routes soothe you. Imagine the steady dip of oars, the flap of sails, the creak of wood, the murmur of voices on crowded docks. Picture the amphorae lined in rows, the coins counted slowly, the ships turning back to sea. It is not a story of sudden wonder, but of calm persistence, a rhythm repeated until it became timeless. And like the tide itself, the Phoenicians remind us that history flows not in bursts, but in steady waves, carrying us gently, endlessly, into sleep. In the long history of Egypt, with its towering pyramids and grand temples, it is easy to imagine that kings and warriors shaped the destiny of the land. Yet much of Egypt's life and endurance was carried on the quiet shoulders of scribes, men who sat with reed pens and ink palettes, writing line after line on papyrus, or carving signs into stone. Their work was not filled with noise or spectacle, but with silence, patience, and endless repetition. To think of an Egyptian scribe, is to imagine hours of stillness, the steady scratch of reed against surface, the unchanging rhythm of symbols flowing, one after another, until whole lives and whole empires were recorded. The training of a scribe began young. Boys were taught to hold the pen, to dip it into black or red ink, and to copy signs from memory. Day after day, they traced the same hieroglyphs: the bird, the reed, the hand, the seated man. Their teachers corrected them, made them repeat the same strokes until each one looked the same, until the hand no longer hesitated. It was monotonous, demanding, and slow, yet through it they learned the discipline that would define their lives. As adults, scribes worked in every corner of Egyptian society. In fields, they walked beside farmers, recording how much grain was harvested, how much was due to the state, how many oxen pulled the plows. They did not swing sickles or guide animals. Their tool was the pen, and their task was to ensure that no sheaf of barley went uncounted. They stood quietly, observing, writing, turning fields of golden stalks into rows of symbols on papyrus sheets. Their work was not exciting, but it was essential, for without their records, the harvest could not be taxed, the temples could not be supplied, the workers could not be fed. In cities, scribes sat in storerooms, surrounded by jars of grain or oil, by stacks of linen and baskets of goods. Each item was listed carefully, each movement in or out noted with a mark. Deliveries from villages were weighed and written down. Distributions to priests or workers were checked against lists. The scribes bent over their tablets, dipped their pens, and wrote line after line, the same phrases repeated endlessly. It was a life of numbers and names, a life of silence broken only by the sound of ink brushing against papyrus. In temples, scribes recorded offerings given to the gods. They noted the animals sacrificed, the jars of wine poured, the bread laid on altars. The priests performed the rituals, but the scribes preserved the record, ensuring that each act was remembered, that each god received proper recognition. The work was steady, never changing, the same rituals written again and again. In courts, scribes wrote down disputes, copying the words of litigants, recording judgments, and sealing them as official documents. These records, though dry and repetitive, carried the weight of law, and their accuracy was trusted more than memory or speech. Even in the great building projects, where thousands of workers hauled stones to construct pyramids and temples, scribes were there. They recorded how many men worked, how many days were spent, how many rations of bread and beer were given out. They did not lift blocks, but their writing ensured that order was kept, that labor was managed, that the vast projects of Egypt could move forward. The life of a scribe was not without small comforts. They often had more security than farmers or laborers, for their skill was valued. Yet their days were long and filled with monotony. They sat cross-legged for hours, backs bent, hands stained with ink. They copied not only new records but also old texts, ensuring that hymns, prayers, and instructions passed from one generation to the next. Sometimes they copied words they did not fully understand, repeating signs with no thought beyond the act of writing. Their task was not to question, but to preserve. What remains of their work today are countless papyri, inscriptions on tomb walls, and carvings in stone. They tell us not only of pharaohs and gods, but also of daily life, accounts of harvests, lists of workers, letters between officials. These documents are not thrilling stories, but they are steady echoes of a civilization that lasted for millennia. Through the silence of scribes, Egypt spoke. To walk among the ruins now is to imagine them still seated in shaded courtyards, pens in hand, writing as the sun moved slowly overhead. Their figures are quiet, their work endless, their impact immeasurable. As you let your body relax, picture the calm of their labor, the slow dipping of reed into ink, the steady scratch of lines, the faint rustle of papyrus. Hear the silence of rooms filled with scribes, each one bent over his work, writing words he had written countless times before. It is a monotony that soothes, a rhythm that lulls, reminding you that much of history is not made in sudden bursts, but in the quiet persistence of men who worked in silence. The scribes of Egypt left us their words, and through them they left us their calm. Let that calm carry you now into sleep, steady and unchanging, like ink on a page. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine raids across seas, fierce warriors with axes and ships cutting through waves. But most of Viking life was not spent in battle. It was spent in villages scattered across the coasts and fjords of Scandinavia, in quiet routines of farming, fishing, and craftwork. The sleepy life of a Viking village was built not on sudden adventures but on repetition, on the steady rhythm of daily tasks, on the quiet persistence that sustained families through long winters and short summers. To picture such a village, imagine wooden houses with turf roofs, smoke rising from hearths, and narrow paths winding between fields and animal pens. The day began early as the sun rose over the horizon. Men and women rose from wooden beds covered in furs, stirred the embers in their hearths, and ate simple breakfasts of bread, porridge, or dried fish. Then they stepped into the cool air, ready to repeat the work that had been done by their parents and grandparents before them. Farming was the foundation of village life. Men led oxen to pull wooden plows through fields of barley, rye, and oats. Women scattered seed, pulled weeds, and carried water in wooden buckets. The soil was rocky, the climate harsh, but through patience and persistence, crops grew. Harvest time was a steady labor of cutting stalks with sickles, binding them into bundles, and storing them in wooden barns. Nothing about it was sudden or glamorous. It was work done slowly, year after year, to ensure bread and ale through the winter. Livestock added to the rhythm. Sheep were sheared for wool, goats and cows milked for dairy, pigs raised for meat. Children chased animals back to pens, carried hay, or fetched water. The sound of bleating and lowing filled the air, blending with the clatter of tools and the voices of families. It was not a world of noise but of constant hum, the same tasks repeated every day. Fishing was another steady labor. Men pushed boats into fjords, cast nets into the water, and waited. The sea gave herring and cod, which were dried on racks or salted for storage. The smell of fish was ever present in the village, carried on the wind, mingling with the smoke of fires and the scent of pine. Nets were repaired by hand, fibers twisted and knotted with care, each repair blending into countless others, part of a rhythm older than memory. Inside the houses, women spun wool into yarn, weaving it on looms into cloth for clothing and sails. Their hands moved with practiced ease, pulling thread back and forth, tapping shuttles, creating patterns that were more functional than decorative. The same motions filled hours, the same sounds of loom and spindle echoing in wooden rooms. Children helped by carding wool or gathering firewood, their laughter soft, their games simple, their days blending into the same routines as their parents. Meals were plain but nourishing, bread baked on flat stones, porridge simmered in iron pots, fish roasted over flames, and ale brewed in barrels. Families gathered at low wooden tables, speaking quietly, sharing food, and finishing quickly before returning to work. On special days, feasts were held with more meat, more ale, and stories told by the fire. But even these followed familiar patterns. Storytelling itself was a routine, sagas repeated until every listener knew the words, passed from one generation to the next in the same tones. The winters were long and dark. Snow covered the fields, winds howled through the houses, and work turned to mending tools, weaving, carving wood, and tending animals indoors. Days were slow, light was short, and time seemed to stretch endlessly. Families sat close to the hearth, listening to the crackle of fire, passing evenings in silence or with quiet stories. The monotony of winter was endured with patience, as it had been for generations. Religion was woven into life through small rituals. Offerings were placed at wooden shrines, prayers whispered to gods for good harvests, calm seas, and protection. Ceremonies were simple, sacrifices of animals or gifts of food, repeated at certain times of year. They were not dramatic spectacles, but quiet traditions, followed steadily, bringing comfort through repetition. To think of a Viking village is to think not of raiders on ships, but of ordinary families in wooden houses, working fields, tending animals, weaving cloth, fishing in fjords. Their lives were steady, patient, and repetitive. They lived by the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, enduring winter, and beginning again. Their legacy is not only ships and raids, but also the quiet persistence of daily life, the monotony that carried them through centuries. As you let your body rest, imagine the soft creak of looms, the gentle lapping of water against wooden boats, the slow movement of oxen in fields, the warm glow of a hearth in a snow-covered village. These are the sounds and sights of Viking life, soothing in their constancy, reminding you that even the fiercest of peoples lived most of their days in silence and repetition. Their sleepy villages were the heart of their world, and their monotony, like the rhythm of your own breath, can carry you gently into sleep. When people hear the word samurai, they often think of warriors in armor, swords flashing in battle, and dramatic duels under the rising sun. Yet behind the image of the warrior stood an entire class of attendants, helpers, and servants, whose lives were not shaped by combat, but by quiet duties, performed day after day in silence. The unremarkable work of these samurai servants filled the spaces between battles, and it was their monotony that allowed the warrior households to function. To imagine their lives is to step away from the clang of swords and into the hum of routine, where every task was repeated, steady, and predictable. A servant's day began before the samurai himself awoke. In wooden houses with paper screens and tatami mats, servants stirred embers to life, boiled water for tea, and prepared rice. They laid out clothing, polished armor, and checked swords. Each blade had to be cleaned carefully, wiped of oil, examined for nicks, polished with powders. This was not dramatic work, but careful routine, done the same way each morning, each evening, without fail. The sword was the soul of the samurai, yet it was the servants' hands that kept it bright. In kitchens, other attendants prepared meals of rice, vegetables, miso, and fish. They stirred pots, cut roots, arranged dishes on trays. The meals were plain, but the process of preparing them followed the same rhythm every day. Bowls were set out, chopsticks placed, trays carried in silence to their masters. Afterward, dishes were washed, floors swept, and tools put back in their places, ready to be used again. Outside, servants tended gardens, raked gravel into smooth patterns, trimmed trees, swept fallen leaves. The work was endless and unchanging. A garden might appear serene to visitors, but its stillness came from hours of repetitive labor. Stones moved, sand leveled, moss watered, plants pruned. Each gesture was small, but together they created a space of quiet order. Other duties were practical. Servants carried messages, prepared horses, fetched supplies from markets. They mended clothing, patched sandals, sharpened tools. They stood watch at doors, welcomed guests, bowed in silence. Nothing about these tasks was dramatic, yet they formed the structure of daily life. Without them, the household would have faltered. When their samurai masters trained, servants were present. They carried practice weapons, cleaned the grounds of the dojo, gathered straw targets, and repaired equipment after use. They swept floors polished by countless feet, ensuring the space was always ready. The sound was of brooms brushing, of cloth against wood, of quiet murmurs. The training might have been fierce, but the duties that surrounded it were monotonous. On journeys, servants walked alongside their masters, carrying bundles of supplies. They led horses, prepared lodgings, lit fires along the road. At inns they unpacked, arranged bedding, prepared meals. The path was long, but the work was always the same: carry, arrange, prepare, repeat. Their presence made travel possible, though their names and faces were forgotten. In times of ceremony, servants moved like shadows. They dressed their masters in armor for processions, tying straps, adjusting helmets, arranging robes. They poured sake into cups, served guests, refilled lamps with oil. Each motion was small, practiced, performed without hesitation. These ceremonies might have appeared impressive to outsiders, but to the servants they were nothing more than another set of tasks to be done in order, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. Even in times of peace, when samurai households settled into routine, the servants' work continued without end. They swept corridors lined with sliding doors, repaired roofs of tile or thatch, drew water from wells, chopped firewood. They lived in the background, their labor invisible, their lives woven into the monotony of service. To be a samurai servant was not to live in glory, but to live in repetition, to wake each day knowing the same duties awaited, to perform them with the same patience, the same silence, until a lifetime had passed. Today, little is remembered of these attendants, for history prefers the image of the warrior. Yet their tasks were as essential as the sword itself. The clean armor, the polished blade, the swept garden, the prepared meal. These were the unremarkable duties that gave shape to a samurai's world. As you rest now, imagine the calm of their work. Picture a servant kneeling over a blade, polishing it with steady hands, the light glinting softly. Picture another sweeping a garden path, gravel whispering under the broom. Hear the faint sounds of rice boiling, of sandals shuffling across wooden floors, of paper doors sliding open and shut. These are the gentle sounds of their lives, unchanging, monotonous, soothing. The samurai may be remembered for their battles, but their households were carried by servants whose quiet persistence made each day possible. And in their unremarkable duties lies a reminder that history is built as much on silent labor as on sudden action. Let their steady rhythm calm you, their repetition soothe you, as you drift into sleep with the same quiet patience that filled their days. When we think of Rome, it is easy to picture triumphal arches, marching legions, and emperors seated on marble thrones. Yet behind all the grandeur of the empire was something far less glamorous, but far more essential: the steady machinery of taxes. The Roman state did not survive on victories alone, but on coins collected from citizens, grain taken from provinces, and endless records kept by officials who worked not in battlefields, but in offices filled with scrolls. The story of Roman taxes is not a tale of drama, but of repetition, a dull rhythm of collection and recording that carried on century after century. Taxes in Rome came in many forms. There were direct taxes on land, assessed according to how much each farmer could produce. Officials visited villages, walked fields, and measured their size with ropes. They asked about harvests, livestock, and orchards, then wrote down the numbers on wax tablets. The process was slow, often stretching across days, with farmers waiting in lines, their names called one after another. For each man, the details were recorded, the sum calculated, and the obligation fixed. The same ritual was repeated year after year, season after season, with little change. There were also taxes in kind. Grain, oil, and wine were delivered from the provinces to supply Rome and its armies. In storehouses along the Tiber, barges unloaded sacks of wheat carried from Egypt or North Africa. Workers lifted them onto their shoulders, stacked them in long rows, and scribes marked each delivery on their tablets. Each sack resembled the last, each entry on the list like countless others before it. The grain was not just food, it was the lifeblood of the city, collected through a system of monotony. Other taxes were indirect, placed on goods sold in markets or transported across roads and rivers. Toll collectors waited at gates or bridges, stopping carts to check their loads. They counted amphorae of wine, bundles of cloth, jars of oil, and demanded the proper payment. Coins clinked into boxes, receipts were written, and the carts rolled on. For the merchants, it was routine. For the collectors, it was endless. Day after day, they watched wagons pass, weighed goods, and wrote sums. It was not excitement, but persistence. The census, held every few years, was another ritual tied to taxation. Citizens gathered to declare their property, their families, their wealth. Officials sat with scrolls, names were read, answers given, and numbers recorded. It was not a moment of drama, but of paperwork, a vast list of who owed what to the state. The census halls were filled with murmurs, the scratching of pens, the shuffle of sandals as people came and went. Rome's armies too depended on taxes. The pay of soldiers, the cost of weapons, the construction of roads and fortresses, all were drawn from the endless stream of revenue. Governors and provinces sent their reports to the capital, detailing how much had been collected and how much had been spent. These reports were read by clerks, copied into archives, and stored. Few ever looked at them again, yet the act of writing and storing was repeated faithfully, for without it the empire could not function. To administer taxes, Rome relied on publicani, private contractors who collected taxes in exchange for a share. They set up offices, hired assistants, and sent agents into villages. Farmers dreaded their arrival, for they pressed for full payment, sometimes more, but even their work followed a pattern. Records were checked, payments noted, receipts issued. It was a system of monotony, not invention, carried out the same way in Spain as in Syria, in Gaul as in Egypt. Today, fragments of these records survive. Inscriptions on stone listing tax rates, papyri detailing collections, receipts written in faded ink. They are not exciting to read, but they show the steady hum of Roman administration. They remind us that the empire, for all its glory, rested on the backs of countless officials and scribes who lived lives of repetition, marking numbers, collecting coins, stacking grain. The story of Roman taxes is a story of monotony, of the quiet persistence that sustained a civilization. As you think of it now, imagine the sound of coins dropping into wooden chests, the scratch of pens on wax, the shuffle of feet in long lines. Picture storehouses filled with sacks of grain, ledgers filled with numbers, officials seated behind tables as farmers waited patiently before them. It is not a tale of glory, but of silence, not a tale of sudden wonder, but of steady duty. And as you rest, let the uneventful story of Roman taxes soothe you, for it is a reminder that history often depends not on battles or speeches, but on the quiet work of ordinary people, repeated endlessly until it becomes the background rhythm of an empire. When we look back on the history of money, the invention of coinage seems like a turning point, a spark of innovation that changed trade forever. Yet the rise of coins was not sudden, not dramatic, but slow, quiet, and uneventful, unfolding across centuries as people moved from weighing lumps of metal to trusting stamped discs. To imagine this transition is not to picture excitement, but to picture merchants and traders repeating the same actions day after day, until the small changes of habit became the foundations of economy. In the earliest markets, trade was done by barter. A farmer brought sacks of grain, a shepherd offered sheep. A potter laid out jars, and exchanges were made directly. When such trades became inconvenient, metals like silver or gold were weighed on scales. Merchants carried small weights, balanced lumps of metal, and agreed on value. It was slow and repetitive, each transaction requiring time, each scale requiring care. Over generations, people grew accustomed to this monotony, until the idea of stamping a piece of metal with a mark of authority offered a way to avoid it. In Lydia, around the 7th century BCE, the first coins appeared. They were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and stamped with small designs. Yet their use was not an explosion of novelty, but a quiet adoption. Traders accepted them slowly, first as curiosities, then as convenience. Each coin bore the same weight and image, removing the need for scales in simple exchanges. Day after day, in markets and ports, people began to use them, not with wonder but with relief at the saved time. The spread of coins to Greece followed the same pattern. City-states minted their own, each marked with symbols of local pride: the owl of Athens, the turtle of Aegina, the Pegasus of Corinth. But to the market trader, the image mattered less than the weight and the trust it carried. Coins clinked against one another, dropped into purses, handed over counters. The sound became familiar, the routine unremarkable. Buyers counted them, sellers checked them, both moving through the motions without thought. The Roman adoption of coinage, too, was gradual. Early coins of bronze and silver circulated beside older methods of trade. Taxes were collected in coin, soldiers paid in coin, markets filled with their metallic hum. But the process was never dramatic. Coins did not suddenly replace all other systems. They simply entered the rhythm of daily life, used here, exchanged there, until they became ordinary. Workers received them for wages, turned them into bread, oil, and wine, and the cycle continued. The uneventful rise of coinage was carried by minting itself, a craft of repetition. In workshops, blanks of metal were cut, heated, and struck between engraved dies. Each blow of the hammer left the same image, again and again, until thousands of coins lay in piles. The work was loud but monotonous, and the coins themselves indistinguishable in their sameness. They were not art to the workers, not innovation, but labor. What remains of these coins today are collections in museums, their surfaces worn, their images faded. They are studied for their beauty, but their true story lies in the monotony of their use. Each coin passed from hand to hand countless times, each one exchanged in ordinary moments: a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, a measure of oil. The weight of history lies not in a single coin, but in the endless repetition of small exchanges. To walk through an ancient market in your imagination is to hear the quiet clink of coins against coins, the murmurs of trade, the shuffle of feet on dusty ground. It is to see coins counted, stacked, and passed, not with ceremony but with indifference. Their rise was not sudden but gradual, not brilliant but practical. a solution to the slow inconvenience of weighing metal. And yet, from this uneventful beginning, money as we know it emerged. As you let your body rest, think of the uneventful rise of coinage. Picture merchants weighing lumps of silver, then turning with relief to stamped discs. Picture the steady clink of coins in purses, the patient hammering of mint workers, the quiet acceptance of buyers and sellers. It is a story of monotony, of small acts repeated until they became habit, until habit became history. And just as coins passed endlessly from hand to hand, let your thoughts drift slowly from one to another, steady, repetitive, soothing, carrying you toward sleep, like the quiet commerce of ancient markets. Across the endless sands of the Sahara, long before modern roads or maps, caravans traced quiet paths that came to be known as the salt roads. These were not routes of sudden adventure or dramatic discovery, but of patient travel, slow repetition, and the steady rhythm of trade. The Sahara itself was vast, stretching farther than the eye could see, dunes rising and falling like waves frozen in silence. Yet through this desert, men and animals moved, carrying blocks of salt on the backs of camels, journeying from mines to markets with calm persistence. To imagine these roads is to imagine not excitement but monotony, the same steps taken each day, the same horizon stretching endlessly, the same goods exchanged at the end of the journey. The salt was cut from mines in great slabs. Workers dug into the earth, chipping carefully with picks, lifting blocks shaped by hand. Each block was heavy, rectangular, and plain. They were stacked in piles, wrapped with ropes, and loaded onto camels. The work was slow, repeated thousands of times, until hundreds of animals stood ready, each bearing its burden of salt. The caravans then began their march. At dawn, the camels were loaded, groaning under their weight, their handlers calling softly, urging them forward. Step by step, the line of animals moved into the desert. The sun rose, the air shimmered with heat, and the sand stretched ahead in silence. Each day was the same, the endless horizon, the creak of saddles, the shuffle of hooves. The men walked beside their animals, guiding them patiently, their thoughts perhaps wandering into the same silence as the desert itself. At night, tents were pitched, fires lit, tea brewed in small pots. The men sat in circles, eating bread and dried meat, speaking little, for the journey was long and words were few. The stars overhead stretched bright across the sky, but even this beauty was part of the routine, seen night after night, guiding the caravans as they had guided countless others before. In the morning, the work began again, camels loaded, ropes tightened, steps taken. The salt roads were not marked by milestones, but by repetition. Each journey mirrored the one before, each caravan following the same tracks worn by centuries of feet and hooves. The destinations of these caravans were markets in towns like Timbuktu and Gao. There, the blocks of salt were unloaded, stacked in rows, and weighed. Traders from other regions arrived with gold, grain, textiles, and other goods. The exchanges were simple: one block of salt for a measure of gold dust, or for food, or for cloth. Coins clinked softly, hands passed goods. Scribes recorded trades on tablets or paper. Nothing about it was sudden, it was steady commerce, repeated endlessly. The salt itself was essential, not luxurious. It preserved food, flavored meals, and sustained life. In lands where the heat was relentless, salt was as valuable as gold, and so the roads of the Sahara pulsed with this quiet trade. Yet to those who walked them, the journey was not a story of wealth, but of labor. The same loading, the same walking, the same unloading, over and over. Even when caravans met, there was little drama. Greetings were exchanged, animals rested, goods compared, and then each group moved on. The desert swallowed all noise, leaving only the hum of wind across sand. Centuries of caravans passed this way, yet the pattern never changed. Today, traces of these salt roads remain. Old caravan routes are still visible in places, faint lines across dunes, stones marking wells where water was drawn. Blocks of ancient salt, long since hardened and brittle, sometimes lie forgotten near old routes. They are reminders of a trade built not on sudden events, but on endless repetition. To think of the salt roads is to think of monotony, the steady plod of camels, the silent expanse of sand, the routine of loading and unloading, the predictable rhythm of trade. And in that monotony there is calm. for it shows us that history is not only battles or wonders, but also quiet persistence. As you let your eyes close, imagine the slow caravan stretching across the desert, the camels moving step by step, the men walking silently beside them. Imagine the sound of hooves pressing into sand, the creak of leather straps, the whisper of wind over dunes. It is a lullaby of repetition, soothing in its constancy, reminding you that the salt roads of the Sahara were not journeys of drama, but of patience. And like the steady beat of your heart, they carried life across silence, one slow step at a time, until both caravan and listener drift gently into rest. When people speak of the Silk Road, they often imagine exotic caravans laden with treasures, mysterious traders moving between east and west, and bustling cities filled with wonders from distant lands. Yet the truth of the Silk Road's growth was not one of sudden excitement or dramatic change. It was slow, repetitive, and often uneventful, built on countless small exchanges, quiet steps across deserts and mountains, and the monotony of journeys repeated again and again. Its history is not a tale of grand discovery, but of steady accumulation, of paths walked until they became roads, of markets that grew from simple stalls to permanent towns. At its heart, the Silk Road was a series of routes rather than a single path. Merchants traveled in short stages, from one oasis to the next, from one city to the next, exchanging goods that passed slowly along the chain. Silk from China moved westward, not in one journey, but through dozens of hands, each trader adding a small profit before sending it further. Spices, glassware, wool, and metals moved in the other direction, yet none of this happened quickly. Caravans advanced at the pace of camels and mules, stopping often, resting in caravanserais, waiting for weather to clear or for water to be found. The rhythm was steady, almost dull. Day after day, animals plodded across sand and stone, their hoofs pressing the same tracks as generations before. Each night, tents were pitched, fires lit, meals of bread and dried meat eaten in silence. The stars wheeled overhead, the wind shifted across dunes, and the next morning the journey began again. In the markets along the route, life followed its own repetition. Merchants displayed bolts of cloth, jars of oil, baskets of fruit, and bundles of spices. Buyers approached, touched the goods, weighed them, argued over price. Coins clinked softly, hands moved goods from one pile to another, scribes recorded transactions. The market closed at dusk, opened again the next day, and the process repeated. For every exotic item that traveled far, there were hundreds of ordinary trades: salt for grain, wool for wine, copper for timber. The Silk Road's growth was not sudden expansion, but slow layering of such exchanges. Cities along the route, like Samarkand and Kashgar, did not become great overnight. They grew because caravans needed places to rest, because markets needed space to expand. Inns were built, wells dug, warehouses erected. Year after year, walls rose higher, streets lengthened, bazaars filled. The growth was measured not in leaps, but in steady increments, each one too small to notice until centuries later, when the path had become a web of trade. Even the dangers of the road became part of its monotony. Bandits lurked in passes, storms swept across deserts, rivers flooded. Yet caravans prepared in the same way each time, hiring guards, carrying extra supplies, waiting out storms in shelters. The dangers were real, but also predictable, woven into the routine. To those who traveled, the Silk Road was not a wonder, but a way of life, long, slow, and repetitive. Religion too moved along these roads, yet in the same quiet fashion. Buddhist monks carried scriptures, stopping at monasteries built near the path. Muslim traders prayed at caravanserais. Their rituals performed in the same words and gestures as at home. Ideas spread not in bursts, but in whispers, carried by travelers who repeated the same prayers in distant lands. What remains today of the Silk Road are ruins of caravanserais, fragments of pottery, worn stones where countless hooves once passed. They tell us not of sudden drama, but of endless footsteps, endless trades, endless nights beneath stars. The dull growth of the Silk Road was what made it endure, a path created not by heroes, but by ordinary traders repeating their work until their work became history. As you let your eyes close, imagine the slow plod of camels, the murmur of merchants, the clink of coins passed hand to hand. Picture the tents glowing in desert twilight, the fires crackling, the steady voices trading goods. Hear the rhythm of the road, unchanging, patient, carrying goods across continents in silence. It is not a story of wonder, but of persistence. Not a story of sudden change, but of dull continuity. And in its monotony lies a calm reminder that history often grows slowly, step by step, until what was once unnoticed becomes the thread that binds worlds together, carrying you gently, like the caravans themselves, into rest. In the ancient world, the survival of great cities did not depend only on armies or rulers, but on something quieter and far more repetitive: the shipments of grain carried across the Mediterranean. Rome, Alexandria, Carthage, and countless ports thrived not because of sudden wonders, but because of steady flows of wheat and barley that moved in ships, loaded and unloaded day after day, year after year, until their monotony became the backbone of empires. To imagine these shipments is to picture a rhythm of work at docks and harbors, of sacks carried on shoulders, of ships rising and falling with the tide, all done without spectacle, but with persistence. The process began in the fields. Farmers cut stalks of grain with sickles, tied them into bundles, and carried them to threshing floors, where oxen walked in circles, trampling stalks to release kernels. Women winnowed the grain, tossing it into the air so the chaff blew away in the wind. The kernels were collected, stored in jars or sacks, and brought to warehouses. This work was slow, seasonal, and repetitive, forming the first link in the long chain of shipment. At the ports, the grain was measured and packed into sacks or amphorae. Dock workers lifted them one by one, loaded them onto carts, and rolled them to waiting ships. The ships themselves were built for capacity more than speed. Their hulls wide, their holds deep, designed to carry thousands of sacks. Sailors stacked them carefully, balancing weight to keep the ship steady at sea. The work was tiring but monotonous. Sack after sack carried down planks, placed in rows, counted, and marked. When the ship was ready, sails were raised, and it slipped out of harbor with the wind. The voyage across the Mediterranean was long but rarely dramatic. The sea could be calm for days, waves lapping gently against the wooden hull, gulls circling above. Sailors adjusted ropes, steered with rudders, and checked the sails. Meals of bread, dried fish, and water were eaten in silence. Watches kept through the night. The journey was not of excitement but of patience, the ship moving steadily across waters, guided by stars and currents, repeating the same routes traced by countless voyages before. At last, the ship reached its destination. In Rome, for example, grain from Egypt was unloaded at Ostia, the great harbor at the mouth of the Tiber. Workers formed lines, carrying sacks ashore, stacking them in warehouses. Officials stood nearby, marking numbers on tablets, checking weights, confirming deliveries. From there, the grain was taken by barge upriver to feed the population of the city. The process was the same each time: unload, record, transport, distribute. There was no novelty, only repetition. The importance of grain shipments lay in their monotony. Cities could not live without them, yet they required no heroics. They required steady work, repeated endlessly: farmers harvesting, dock workers loading, sailors sailing, officials recording. Each person played a small role, unnoticed, yet together they sustained entire populations. The empire depended on bread, and bread depended on ships filled with grain. Even the famous phrase, bread and circuses, in Rome was rooted in the system. The people of the city expected their grain, delivered as part of the annona, the state's distribution. Without the regular arrival of ships, unrest could spread, and so emperors ensured that fleets sailed on schedule, that warehouses stayed full, that the quiet rhythm of grain shipments never faltered. Today, when we see ruins of harbors, fragments of amphorae, or inscriptions listing shipments, we glimpse this history of monotony. They remind us of the countless voyages made, of the endless sacks carried, of the unchanging cycle of harvest, transport, and delivery. The grain trade was not exciting, but it was steady, and its steadiness was what made it powerful. As you close your eyes, imagine the slow creak of ships in harbor, the footsteps of dock workers carrying sacks, the soft clink of amphorae stacked in rows, the murmur of officials recording numbers. Picture the sails swelling with wind, the calm water stretching to the horizon, the ship moving at its slow pace toward a city waiting for its bread. It is a story of repetition, of patience, of quiet persistence, and like the rhythm of waves against a hull, it is soothing, steady, carrying you gently toward rest. The grain shipments across the Mediterranean were uneventful, yet they sustained empires, and in their monotony we find calm, a reminder that history often rests not on wonders, but on the steady hum of ordinary labor. When people think of ancient Greece, they often imagine marble temples, dramatic theaters, and the voices of philosophers echoing in public squares. Yet much of Greek life was shaped not by lofty ideas, but by quiet crafts, repeated endlessly in workshops and households. Pottery, though often admired now in museums for its painted designs, was for the Greeks a matter of daily use, produced through steady labor made for carrying water, storing oil, or holding wine. To understand the craft of pottery is to step into a world of repetition, of wheels spinning, of clay shaped by hand, of kilns fired with wood, and of tasks so familiar that generations of potters performed them without pause. The process began with clay dug from the earth. Workers carried it in baskets, softened it with water, and kneaded it until it was pliable. This was not quick work, but long and repetitive, hands pressing, folding, and smoothing, removing stones and air pockets. The clay was then left to rest, covered so it would not dry too quickly, prepared for the next stage. Day after day, these same motions were repeated, for without them, the clay could not be shaped. At the potter's wheel, the rhythm continued. The wheel spun, turned by hand or foot, and the lump of clay rose slowly as fingers pressed its sides. A jar, a bowl, or a cup began to take shape, but never in a sudden moment of inspiration. It was guided by experience, by muscle memory, by patience. The potter's hands moved steadily, shaping the curve, adjusting the lip, thinning the walls. The wheel spun without end, the same shapes made again and again. Some vessels were plain, others prepared for painting, but all passed through the same monotonous routine. Once shaped, the pottery dried slightly before being painted or incised. Designs were added in black or red, figures of gods, animals, or daily life. Yet for the artisans, these images were not masterpieces but familiar patterns. They traced lines they had traced many times before, copied forms passed down from teacher to apprentice. The brush strokes were slow, careful, repetitive. The decoration might seem artful to us, but to them it was work, carried out with the same rhythm as kneading or shaping. The firing of the pottery required patience as well. Kilns were filled with vessels, stacked carefully, the fire lit, the heat rising gradually. Potters watched smoke, adjusted vents, added fuel, waited. The process could last hours, even days, requiring constant attention, yet it was not dramatic. It was steady, repetitive labor, watching flames, checking temperature, ensuring that the clay hardened evenly. The pots emerged, sometimes successful, sometimes cracked, but always part of the cycle, repeated with the next load of clay. In households, pottery filled every corner of daily life. Amphorae stored oil and wine, craters mixed drinks, kylixes served them. Small cups held water, cooking pots simmered stews, storage jars preserved grain. Each vessel was used, cleaned, set aside, and used again. They broke often, for pottery is fragile, but new ones were always at hand, their production so constant that no household was ever without. The abundance of Greek pottery found today in ruins and graves is not proof of extravagance, but of repetition. Millions of vessels were made, each one the result of the same motions performed by countless potters. Their survival shows us the scale of monotony, the quiet persistence of craft carried on for centuries. To think of the potters of ancient Greece is to think not of sudden inspiration, but of steady labor. Imagine the wheel spinning, the clay rising slowly, the hands pressing gently, the fire crackling in kilns, the brushes tracing familiar lines. Imagine the silence of workshops, broken only by the creak of the wheel, the chatter of apprentices, the faint hum of work done without haste. It is a picture of patience, of rhythm, of monotony that gave life to a civilization. As you rest, let your thoughts follow that spinning wheel. Let the steady motion soothe you, the image of clay rising and falling with gentle pressure, the sound of fire whispering in kilns, the quiet persistence of artisans shaping vessels. The craft of pottery in ancient Greece was uneventful, but it endured, just as sleep comes not in bursts, but in slow repetition, breath after breath, moment after moment. And in this quiet craft lies a reminder that even the simplest work, repeated without end, can shape history, leaving behind not only beauty, but also calm. When we see the towering cathedrals of Europe today, it is tempting to imagine that they rose quickly into the sky, as if built by sudden bursts of inspiration or genius. Yet the reality of their construction was slow, repetitive, and filled with monotony. The building of a cathedral often took decades, sometimes centuries, stretching across the lives of generations. The stones we admire now were placed one by one, lifted by ropes and pulleys, shaped by chisels and hammers, carried by hands that knew only the rhythm of labor. To understand a cathedral's construction is to step into a world of endless repetition, where progress was measured not by years, but by lifetimes. The process began with foundations. Trenches were dug by laborers, earth lifted out in baskets, stones lowered carefully into place. Mortar was mixed with water and lime, spread with trowels, and pressed between blocks. The same motions were repeated day after day, until the base was steady enough to carry the weight above. Then the walls began to rise. Quarrymen cut stone from cliffs, shaping it into blocks. Each block was hauled by oxen to the building site, lifted onto scaffolds, and set into place. Masons worked with chisels, carving details into capitals and arches, their hands striking in steady rhythm, tap after tap, stroke after stroke. Carpenters built scaffolds of wood, beams tied together with rope, platforms laid plank by plank. These structures rose alongside the walls, adjusted as the height grew, rebuilt when they weakened. The sound of hammer against wood, chisel against stone, and the creak of ropes filled the air, not as a song of sudden triumph, but as a drone of continuous work. Vaults and arches required patience. Wooden frames were set up to hold stones in place as they were laid. Each stone had to be cut precisely, its weight balanced by others, its curve fitting the whole. The workers repeated the process slowly, layer by layer, until the frame could be removed and the arch stood on its own. The repetition stretched for months, even years, yet without it, the structure could not hold. Roofs too required steady labor. Carpenters shaped beams, raised them high, and joined them with pegs. Tiles were laid one after another, overlapping to keep out rain. Lead sheets were hammered into place, seams sealed with care. Each piece was small, each motion repetitive, but together they created a roof strong enough to last for centuries. Stained glass added its own quiet rhythm. Glaziers cut pieces of colored glass, shaped them with files, and set them into lead frames. The images of saints, kings, and scenes were not painted in bursts of inspiration, but built piece by piece, section by section, with patient labor. When finished, the windows were lifted into place, glowing when the sun shone through. The effect might have felt wondrous, but to those who made them it was simply work, repeated for years in dim workshops. Sculptors carved figures for portals and facades, chiseling stone into saints, angels, and animals. Their tools struck the same surfaces again and again, flakes of stone falling at their feet. Many sculptors never saw their work finished, for cathedrals outlasted their lifetimes. The figures we admire now were the result of countless hours of monotony, not sudden genius. Even when the cathedral was partially complete, services were held within its walls. Priests prayed, choirs sang, incense burned, while outside workers continued. The people of the town lived with the sound of construction as a constant background, knowing that their children and grandchildren might never see the building finished. For them, the cathedral was less a project than a presence, always rising slowly, never complete. Some cathedrals took over 100 years to finish. By the time a spire was raised, the foundations had already aged. By the time the last window was installed, the first had faded. And yet the work continued, each generation adding its piece, repeating the same motions as those before, until at last the cathedral stood as a monument to patience as much as to faith. Today, when we walk through these cathedrals, we feel awe at their scale, but behind that awe is monotony. Behind every soaring arch is a mason who tapped stone day after day. Behind every glowing window is a glazier who cut glass until his hands were numb. Behind every sculpture is a chisel mark, one of thousands, struck without drama but with persistence. the slow construction of medieval cathedrals, was history written not in sudden brilliance, but in repetition, in the quiet rhythm of labor that stretched across centuries. As you rest, imagine the sound of chisels tapping stone, the creak of scaffolds, the shuffle of workers carrying blocks, the smell of lime and dust. Imagine the walls rising slowly, the arches forming, the windows glowing. It is a story not of excitement, but of calm, not of speed, but of patience. And like the rhythm of breath, it reminds us that greatness is often built slowly, one small act at a time, until centuries of repetition create something that endures. In the bustling towns of medieval Europe, long before the rise of factories and machines, the work of everyday life was shaped by guilds. These organizations of craftsmen and tradesmen regulated how bread was baked, how shoes were made, how cloth was woven, how tools were forged. Yet behind the idea of guilds as pillars of community and commerce lay a life of plain routine, where each guildsman rose in the morning to repeat the same tasks he had done the day before, and where the dignity of craft was carried not by moments of excitement, but by steady monotony. To imagine the life of a guildsman is to picture narrow streets lined with workshops, shutters open to reveal men at benches, tools in hand, their heads bent to their work. A shoemaker sat at his wooden table, cutting leather into shapes, stitching them together with awls and thread. The same patterns were traced again and again, the same motions repeated until his fingers moved without thought. A blacksmith hammered iron on an anvil, sparks flying with each strike, yet the rhythm of his hammer was as steady as a clock, blow after blow, shaping tools that resembled countless others he had made before. The work of a guild was defined by order. Apprentices learned from masters by imitation, copying every gesture, repeating every motion until it became second nature. A boy sweeping the floor would in time be allowed to file edges, then to carve details, then to complete small pieces, but each step required years of repetition. Journeymen traveled from town to town, working in different shops, but their duties remained the same: mix dough, cut cloth, shape wood, forge nails. The title might change, but the rhythm of labor did not. The guild regulated every aspect of production. Bread must be baked to a certain weight, cloth woven to a certain width, shoes stitched in a certain style. Inspectors visited shops to check quality, their presence a reminder that work was not art, but rule-bound routine. Each craftsman followed the standards, producing goods that were predictable and uniform. Customers wanted reliability, not surprise, and so the guildsmen worked in steady patterns, guided by regulations that ensured sameness. In the evenings, guild meetings were held. Members gathered in halls, sat at long tables, and discussed matters of trade. They spoke of prices, wages, and apprenticeships, their conversations less dramatic than administrative. Decisions were made by vote, rules confirmed, disputes settled. Records were written in ledgers, pages filled with names, dues, and fines. The meetings ended with meals or prayers, and the men returned home, ready to repeat the same cycle the next day. Daily life for guildsmen was shaped not only by their craft, but also by the town itself. Bells rang to mark hours, markets opened at dawn, stalls filled with goods. Bakers sold loaves, butchers displayed cuts of meat, weavers unrolled cloth. Each guild occupied its place, its work visible in the steady hum of town life. Festivals added brief color with banners and processions, but even these followed predictable patterns year after year. Religion, too, was tied to the guilds. Each had its patron saint, honored with masses and offerings. On feast days, members marched in processions, carrying candles or banners, singing hymns together. These rituals, like their work, were repetitive, unchanged across generations. Faith gave rhythm to their labor, sanctifying the monotony rather than breaking it. For the guildsmen themselves, life held small variations, but little surprise. A baker rose before dawn, lit his oven, kneaded dough, baked loaves, and sold them until his shelves were empty. A tailor cut cloth, stitched seams, measured customers, and made garments with the same patterns used for decades. A carpenter shaped planks, built chests, repaired doors, his workshop filled with the smell of sawdust. Each man knew his craft. Each craft demanded endless repetition. Today, when we see guild records or the goods they produced, we may admire their skill, yet what truly defined them was persistence. The plain life of guildsmen was not one of invention, but of continuation, each man preserving the methods of his master, each apprentice learning to repeat them in turn. It was a life of order, of sameness, of dignity in monotony. As you close your eyes, imagine the steady tap of hammers in workshops, the soft scrape of knives against leather, the creak of looms weaving cloth, the low murmur of voices in guild halls. Picture the narrow streets lined with shops, the smell of bread from bakeries, the glow of forges in the evening. It is not a scene of drama, but of calm repetition, soothing in its constancy. The plain life of medieval guildsmen reminds us that history is built as much on monotony as on moments of glory, and in their quiet labor we find the rhythm of life itself, steady and enduring, like breath guiding you gently into sleep. In medieval Europe, the market day was the heartbeat of a town or village, not because it was exciting or extraordinary, but because it was steady, predictable, and repeated endlessly. Once a week, sometimes more often, people gathered in squares to buy, sell, and exchange goods. To imagine a medieval market day is to imagine a scene not of spectacle, but of routine. The same stalls set up, the same wares displayed, the same voices calling, the same coins changing hands, week after week, generation after generation. At dawn, traders arrived, pushing carts or leading animals, their goods bundled in sacks or packed in baskets. They set up wooden stalls, spread cloth over tables, and arranged items in familiar order. The butcher laid out cuts of meat, the baker stacked loaves of bread, the potter displayed jars and bowls, the weaver unrolled bolts of cloth. Farmers carried in baskets of eggs, onions, beans, and apples, arranging them in neat piles. Nothing about it was new. It was the same scene repeated as faithfully as the tolling of the church bell. As the market opened, townspeople and villagers gathered. They walked among the stalls, examining goods, weighing fruit in their hands, pressing cloth between their fingers. They spoke in low voices, asked prices, and haggled softly. The conversations repeated themselves. How much for this? Too much? Can you lower it? Take it for this much. Coins clinked, hands exchanged goods, and the process continued. From one end of the square to the other, the same rhythm echoed, day after market day. The market was not only for food and cloth. Animals were sold too. Sheep bleated, pigs squealed, chickens clucked in baskets. Buyers inspected them, checked their weight or health, and bargained. Children ran between stalls, their laughter blending with the noise of animals and merchants. Yet even this had a routine to it, for each market day sounded much like the last. The smells were mixed but familiar: fresh bread, roasting meat, hay, wool, leather, and the earthy scent of animals filled the air. Smoke from fires drifted across the square, mingling with the voices of traders calling out the same words they had called for years. Scribes or officials sometimes sat at the edges of markets, keeping notes, recording taxes or tolls, watching transactions. They marked lists with steady hands, the names and numbers blending into endless lines. For them, the market was not lively but mechanical, each entry resembling the last, each week adding to their ledgers. By midday, the market was at its busiest. People filled the square, but the rhythm never quickened. Buyers continued to examine goods, sellers continued to repeat their prices, animals continued to shuffle and cry. The sun moved slowly across the sky, casting the same shadows as it always had, and the market carried on with unchanging pace. By evening, the stalls began to close. Goods were packed away, tables folded, baskets carried home. Unsold bread was taken back to ovens, animals led back to pens, cloth rolled up for another day. The square grew quiet, the stones once again empty until the next week. The market had ended, but its cycle would return, as it always did, without alteration. For the people of medieval towns, market day was less an event than a certainty. It tied their lives to a rhythm of buying and selling, of meeting and parting, of repetition that spanned centuries. The goods may have shifted with the seasons, apples in autumn, wool in winter, herbs in spring, but the pattern was the same. Traders came, stalls were set, goods exchanged, stalls packed away. It was a ritual of commerce, unremarkable but necessary. Today, when we imagine medieval markets, we may think of color and noise, but behind that image was monotony. The same stalls, the same faces, the same goods, the same bargains. The details blurred together week after week, year after year. What gave the market its power was not excitement, but persistence. As you rest, imagine the slow rhythm of market day. Picture the cobbled square, the wooden stalls, the baskets of grain, the animals shifting in pens. Hear the low murmur of voices, the clink of coins, the creak of carts. Smell the bread, the hay, the leather, the smoke. It is a world of repetition, soothing in its constancy, calming in its predictability. The monotony of medieval market days was not a flaw, but the very thing that sustained life, just as the steady rhythm of breath sustains you now as you drift into sleep. In the quiet world of the Middle Ages, long before printing presses and mechanical type, books were born in scriptoria, workshops within monasteries where monks copied texts by hand. These places were not filled with sudden brilliance or invention, but with monotony, with the slow work of quills scratching across parchment, with the faint rustle of vellum, with the patient repetition of letters and lines. To understand the life of a scriptorium is to enter a room of silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of writing, where time itself seemed to stretch as words unfolded in endless repetition. A monk's day in the scriptorium began after morning prayers. Having risen before dawn to chant psalms, he took his seat at a desk of wood, lit by narrow windows or by the glow of candles. Before him lay a sheet of parchment, prepared from animal skin, smoothed with pumice, whitened with chalk. His quill, cut carefully from a goose feather, rested in an inkwell of black or red ink. There was no rush, only calm preparation. The monk adjusted his posture, dipped the quill, and began to write. Letter by letter, line by line, the text appeared. Each stroke was deliberate, repeated countless times before. An A shaped, a B curved, a C drawn, then again, until the page filled. The script was uniform, precise, trained by years of practice. There was no room for flourish, only for exactness. To copy a text was to repeat what had already been written, to become part of a chain of voices stretching across centuries. Hours passed in this silence. Monks wrote slowly, their eyes moving from the exemplar, the book being copied, to their own page, back and forth, checking every word. Mistakes were rare, but when they came, they were corrected with a knife, scraping the parchment, smoothing it again, and rewriting. Even this act was steady, calm, unhurried. The scriptorium was not a place of noise, but of patience. In winter, the work was done in cold rooms, fingers stiff, breath visible in the air. In summer, the light was brighter, the air warmer, yet the routine remained. Dip the quill, write the line, finish the page, begin again. Breaks came with the ringing of bells, calling monks to meals or prayers, but after each interruption, they returned to their desks, continuing as before. Illumination added another layer of monotony. Some monks specialized in decoration, painting initials in red and blue, adding gold leaf to borders, tracing vines and animals in margins. To us, these appear as art, but to the monks they were duties, carried out with careful repetition. Gold leaf was applied with the same brush, patterns repeated, colors mixed and layered with patience. The result was beauty, but the process was slow and unchanging. The copying of a single book could take months, sometimes years. Each page required hours, each chapter days, each volume a lifetime of labor. Yet the monks did not seek speed. Their task was to preserve, to transmit knowledge faithfully, to repeat the words of scripture, law, or history so that they would not be lost. The slow work of scriptoria built the libraries of Europe, not through brilliance but through monotony. Today, when we see medieval manuscripts, we see their bright colors, their careful letters, their beauty. But behind them was repetition. Behind every page lay hours of writing. Behind every letter, the steady movement of a quill. Behind every decoration, the patient stroke of a brush. They remind us not of sudden creativity, but of quiet persistence. To imagine the scriptorium is to hear the faint scratch of quills, the soft shuffle of robes, the low whisper of prayer. It is to picture rows of monks bent over desks, eyes straining in dim light, hands moving steadily, hour after hour, day after day. It is to feel the calm weight of silence, the monotony that filled centuries of copying. As you let your body rest, think of that silence. Picture the parchment spread before you, the quill dipping into ink, the letters forming one after another. Hear the quiet rhythm of strokes, the stillness of the room, the slow unfolding of words. The scriptoria of monasteries were places of monotony, yet in their monotony they preserved the knowledge of the world. And like their steady labor, your own breath repeats itself, calming you, carrying you gently toward sleep. In the castles and manor halls of medieval Europe, justice was not delivered in sudden drama, but in slow routine. The feudal courts that governed the daily disputes of peasants and tenants were less like the grand trials we imagine today, and more like gatherings of repetition, where the same cases were heard, the same judgments given, the same records kept, week after week, year after year. To understand the life of a feudal court is to see not noise but monotony, not glory but predictability, where law was carried less by brilliance than by patience. A typical session began in the great hall of a manor. Wooden benches were placed, a table stood for the lord or his steward, and villagers assembled. The cases were small, a boundary dispute between neighbors, a question of unpaid rent, a quarrel over livestock. Each case was presented, often in halting words, witnesses called, testimony given. The steward or bailiff listened, nodded, and applied the customary law, which had been spoken so many times before that it required little thought. The judgment was not innovation, but repetition, the same decision given countless times for the same kind of quarrel. Scribes sat with wax tablets or parchment, recording the details. Their pens scratched softly as they wrote names, dates, fines, and verdicts. The entries resembled one another so closely that entire ledgers could pass without variation. A cow strayed, a fence broken, a debt unpaid. Again and again, the same words appeared, the same fines imposed, the same lines added to the record. For the people of the village, these courts were not places of spectacle, but of necessity. They attended because they had to, because disputes needed resolution, because rents must be confirmed, because obligations had to be remembered. They stood, spoke briefly, listened, and left. Their lives touched not by excitement, but by the dull machinery of law. The court also served as a place where feudal obligations were reaffirmed. Tenants declared their services owed to the lord. So many days of plowing, so many days of harvest, so many payments in grain or livestock. These declarations were recited aloud, checked against records, and entered once more into the ledgers. The process was long, repetitive, and utterly predictable. Nothing about it was sudden. It was the slow heartbeat of the feudal system, repeating itself generation after generation. Punishments were simple and often symbolic. Fines were the most common, measured in coins or in kind. Sometimes a wrongdoer was ordered to repair a fence, return an animal, or perform extra service. Rarely was violence or spectacle involved. The court functioned by steady correction, by the repetition of small penalties that kept order without drama. Even the larger cases, inheritance of land, disputes over dowries, claims to tenancy, were heard in the same fashion. Testimony was given, documents read, customs applied, judgments pronounced. There was little suspense, for the outcome was usually guided by precedent, by rules known to all, by the same logic used for centuries. What gave the feudal court its power was not surprise, but sameness. Today, the records of these courts survive in archives, filled with lines of ink that repeat the same formulas. So-and-so appeared, he was fined, the court orders this. To read them is to feel the monotony of medieval justice, the endless rhythm of disputes and resolutions. Yet it was this monotony that preserved order, that allowed villages to function, that tied peasants to lords and lords to law. To picture a feudal court is to imagine the low murmur of voices in a wooden hall, the scratch of quills on parchment, the shuffle of feet as villagers waited their turn. It is to hear the same questions asked, the same answers given, the same judgments repeated. It is not a scene of drama, but of calm, of order maintained through routine. And in that monotony lies its meaning. As you rest now, let the thought of these predictable courts soothe you. Imagine the hall filled with quiet villagers, the steward listening patiently, the scribes writing steadily, the judgments spoken in calm voices. Picture the day ending as the villagers return to their fields, their disputes resolved not by brilliance, but by the steady hum of custom. The predictable routine of feudal courts was not exciting, but it was enduring, and it carried medieval life forward in its unchanging rhythm. And so we close this story here, at the end of our long journey through 30 parts of boring history. Together we have walked among scribes and farmers, traders and guildsmen, potters and sailors, hearing the soft monotony of their lives. Their stories remind us that history is not only kings and battles, but also the quiet persistence of ordinary people. Let that persistence lull you now, as the steady rhythm of their lives blends with the steady rhythm of your breath, carrying you into calm, carrying you into sleep. Thank you, dear friends, for choosing to spend your night with Sleep Whisper. May your morning bring you luck, gentle joy, and success in all the work you do. Until tomorrow night, when we meet again here at Sleep Whisper, sleep well and rest peacefully.